Hello. Good afternoon. Good evening, sir. Hello. Nice to meet you. Hi. Greeting. What a surprise, right? Um. Um. Welcome to my stream. I hope the microphone is okay. I hope that it can capture my voice nicely, so that I can read nicely to all of you. Hello. I don't think that there's one in my stream right now. It's okay. I want to finish up reading for myself, but if any of you want to join me, very much welcome. I hope Dimitri catch this because poor thing. Dimitri is one of my sub that like he just follows me to and even sub to me at one point. At one point to for my reading content, and then I stopped doing. And well, let's just say that for the past 6 months, it has been hell on earth. I went through a lot of stuff that I don't really want to repeat. Death and such that's still affecting me to this day. But I don't want to get into it. It's too sad. It's too sad. But anyway, whoever watching this on, most probably I have more people watch me on YouTube after I port the video over somehow. But anyway, whoever watching this, thank you so much for watching this, and also thank you so much for your interest in my reading content. This is my main content. I to repeat, what's my identity? Who am I? I'm Ariana Nuna. I am a decade-long player of Final Fantasy 14. Casual player. I play the content like it's a solo content. When I need to rating, I play with other people, but otherwise I just like to watch other people. I don't like that bothering. But a half years ago, my friend start a Twitch stream so that I can other people because I like reading to people. Here I am and find all the books that I've read the past 2.5 years in the playlist section of my YouTube channel and also my Twitch channel. But I would highly recommend you go to my channel because it's so much easier to find videos there compared to Twitch. I have a playlist for like just especially for Kazuo Ishiguro, Natsume Soseki. If I repeat a writer, I will make a playlist for them. Otherwise, they all fall under Noodible. Various writers, I think the playlist is called. But or just Noodible in general. I think I have over 90, almost 100 now. 100 videos now of me reading. So I've been reading a lot for the past 2.5 years. But this year I definitely took a back seat, and I didn't read that much because a lot of like IRL stuff happening, not happening, happening. That might stop me from doing what I like doing most. But here I am. I'm back. Sorry. I hope this introduction is good enough. And that you all know, to those who just tune in, will understand what I do. I'm not a raider. I'm not a professional Final Fantasy 14 raider, or even like I'm very casual. Even when I raid, it's just for fun. I don't take things seriously. I don't think I ever take anything seriously. Maybe my mental health. Anyway, coffee is still hot, so let's go. I hope that's a good enough introduction. Some of you just joined or just found out my channel, wherever. So here we go. Okay. So the last video was the last video on Noodible. Okay, Noodible is a portmanteau. Sorry, portmanteau of Nuna, which is my name, Ariana Nuna. So you should call me Nuna in game. Call me Ariana. It's too long. And Audible. Nuna plus Audible is Noodible. Lame, I know it's lame, but it is what it is. So the last book I was reading was The Gate by Natsume Soseki. I was enjoying it. I read until chapter 6, and that was the last video for Noodible of this year, which is in March of this year. 9 months ago. I really apologize for that. There's just too many things going on, so I'm trying to compress. Anyway, I can start now because okay. I did put a party finder. I'm not going to repeat the party finder. If it's gone, it's gone. I'm just gonna enjoy reading my book. So I will try my best not to interrupt myself too much when I'm reading. So I hope you guys are in here. Just have your cup of tea or coffee or whatever drink that you like most, and just enjoy the session. I don't know how long I'll read today. I do have to rate later, so maybe about 2 hours. Yeah. So without further ado, let's continue reading. Okay. Anyway, let's go. Let's read Natsume Soseki, The Gate, chapter 7. Ended at chapter 6. So we are going to start with chapter 7. Natsume Soseki. The crypto mirror around Enmyoji had turned reddish black, as though scorched. On clear days, a jagged white line of mountains appeared along the distant rim of the scarred sky. The waning year pursued the couple, each passing day, driving them further into the cold. The cry of the natto peddler, as he made his regular morning rounds, was redolent of the frost that gripped the roof tiles. Listening to the cry as he lay in bed, Sosuke realized that winter had come again. Oyone had begun her annual vigil, worrying over what might go wrong between year's end and the coming of spring. Let's hope the pipes don't freeze like last year, he would mutter in the kitchen. Evenings, the couple kept close company with the kotatsu. They recalled wistfully the mild winters of Hiroshima and Fukuoka. We're just like Mr. and Mrs. Honda across the way. Yone laughed. Hondas were a retired couple who lived in the same tract and likewise rented from the Sakai. With the assistance of one young housemaid, they lived such a quiet life that from morning till night, not so much as a squeal or a scrape could be heard from their house. From time to time, Oyone, alone sewing in the sitting room, could hear a voice calling out, "Grandpa," which was how old Mrs. Honda referred to her husband. When on occasion she bumped into Mrs. Honda at her gate or elsewhere outside her house, they would exchange formal greetings appropriate to the season, and Mrs. Honda would invite Oyone over for a chat. Oyone, however, had never paid a single visit, nor had Mrs. Honda ever called on her. What she knew about the old couple was then very sketchy. That the Hondas had one son who had an excellent post in the administration of the Residency General of Korea or some such office, and who sent them enough money each month for them to live comfortably. This much she had gleaned from someone who delivered goods for one of the local shops. Is old Mr. Honda still fiddling around with his potted plants? Sosuke asked. It's too cold for that now. He's probably stopped. There are a lot of pots stacked up under their veranda. Conversation then shifted from the house across the lane to their landlord's domicile. The polar opposites of the Hondas, this household struck the couple as lively in the extreme. At this season the ground was desolate and no longer swarmed with the boisterous play of children, but the sound of the piano persisted night after night. Even the raucous laughter of scullery maids and whoever else was in the kitchen reverberated down to the couple's sitting room. What does this fellow do for a living? Sosuke asked. For some time now he had been pestering Oyone with such questions. I don't suppose he has. Sorry. I don't suppose he does anything but amuse himself, he said, repeating what had become her stock answer to questions along these lines. What's with his land holdings and rental properties? Sosuke's inquisitiveness on the subject of Sakai went no further than this. In the past, after he had withdrawn from the university, whenever Sosuke ran into someone who wore about him the boastful air of occupying an enviable position in the world, he had to stifle the impulse to say, just you wait and see. With time, this impulse turned into a more generalized sense of hatred. In the last year or two, however, he had become totally indifferent to the distinction between himself and others. The view he had come to adopt was this: just as he had been born to lead the life that he was living, so others had come into the world bearing their own destinies. In Inasmuch as he and these others belonged to different subspecies to begin with, there was no connection, aside from coexisting as members of the human race, between himself and others, therefore no grounds for contending interests. Consequently, although he might occasionally ask in idle conversation, what does so and so do for a living? Would hardly be bothered, and even to listen carefully, the reply. For the most part, Oyone shared this difference towards others, but tonight she uncharacteristically responded to Sosuke's question at length and proceeded to mention that Mr. Sakai was a man of about 40 and clean-shaven, that the daughter was always practicing the piano, was the eldest, 11 or 12 years old, and that when the other children came to play, they were not allowed to use the swing. Why is it that the other children can't use the swing? Asked Sosuke. Well, it seems that Mr. Sakai is stingy and doesn't want the swing to wear out so soon. Sosuke burst out laughing. The image of a skinflint evoked by such rumors was totally at odds with the landlord who, at the first mention of a leak, had in fact immediately sent a roofer over and who, apprised their hedge had rotted out, had dispatched his own gardener to address the problem. That night, neither Honda's pots nor Sakai's swings turned up in Sosuke's dreams. Having gone to bed around 10:30, he snored like a man exhausted by the myriad phenomena of the universe. Oyone, who had lately had trouble sleeping because of a lingering headache, opened her eyes from time to time and looked about the dimly lit room. A small lamp was sitting in the alcove. They were accustomed to keeping it burning throughout the night and placed it there at bedtime after turning the wick down. Oyone moved her pillow about nervously. With each change in position, the shoulder on which she slept slid out a bit farther across the futon until she ended up turned over on her stomach. She then propped herself with her elbows and gazed for a while at her husband. Finally, she stood up and covering her nightgown with the rope that had been laid out at the foot of the bed, picked up the lamp up from the alcove. Coming around to Sosuke's side of the bed, she crouched down and called out to him. He was no longer snoring, having resumed the regular breathing of deep sleep. Straightening up, slid open the partition and, lamp in hand, entered the sitting room. In the midst of the dark room, where the lamplight shone wanly close to the hand, she could make out the dull sheen of chest metal rings. Skirting the chest, she peered into the dark, sooty kitchen. There, all she could make out were the dim white soji panels. After standing motionless in the middle of the stone-cold kitchen, she stealthily slid open the door to the maid's room on her right, and shined the lamp inside. Hio lay there curled up in a ball like a mole amid tangled bedding whose patterns and colors could not be distinguished. Next, she looked left into the six-mat room. In the emptiness that yawned before her, what immediately caught her was the mirror on its stand, all the eerier in the darkness. Having made a complete tour of the house and having reassured herself that all was as it should be, Oyone went back to bed. Eventually she closed her eyes. This time, she found that she could contrive not to focus on the every flutter of her eyelid, and after a while drifted off to sleep. All of a sudden, her eyes popped open again. There had been a thud, a heavy thud, she was sure, somewhere close to where she lay sleeping. Raising her head off the pillow and pricking up her ears, she pondered a moment and concluded that it had resembled nothing so much as the sound that would have been made by a very large object tumbling down the embankment behind the house and landing just beyond the veranda that bordered the room where they slept. She further concluded that it had actually happened but a moment ago, just before she opened her eyes, and not in a dream. The realization filled her with dread. She tugged at her husband's bedclothes as he lay sleeping beside her, this time determined to wake him. Sosuke, who had been sleeping very soundly up to that moment, abruptly opened his eyes. "Let's get up right now," Oyone said as she shook him. All right, that's enough," he responded, still half asleep, and sat up straight in his futon. Oyone half whispered to him that what she had heard. "There was only a single thud?" he asked. "Yes, but I heard it just now." They both fell silent, their attention riveted on whatever might transpire outside, but all was perfectly still. No matter how long and hard they strained to hear, had nothing else tumbling down their way. Complaining of the cold, Sosuke pulled a jacket on over his unlined sleeping robe and stepped out into the veranda where he slid back on the rain shutters. He peered out into the darkness and saw nothing. A wave of cold air pressed against his skin. He quickly closed the shutter. After latching it, Sosuke burrowed once again under the bedding. "There's nothing out there," he said, turning over on his side. "You must be dreaming." Oyone insisted that she had not been dreaming. She was adamant. There was certainly had been a not loud noise just overheard. Sosuke stuck his head partway out from under the covers and faced Oyone. "Yourself these days, you've worked yourself up into quite a state. You really need to calm down or you'll never have a proper sleep. Just then, the pendulum clock in the next room struck 2. Momentarily, deprived of speech by the chimes, they both fell silent, upon which the night grew utterly still. The couple's eyes were now wide open. Neither of them showed any sign of falling back to sleep. "That's easy for you to say," Oyone resumed their previous conversation. "You're always so relaxed. You only have to lie down for 10 minutes and you are unconscious." I may fall down, so I may fall asleep fast, but it's from fatigue, not from being relaxed," Sosuke replied. In the midst of the conversation, he nodded off again. Oyone continued to toss and turn. In front of the house, a wagon passed by with a terrible clatter. Several times recently, Oyone had been startled before dawn by the sound of the wagon. Thinking about these various episodes, she had come to the conclusion that since it's always happened about the same time, it must be a delivery wagon traveling in the same route every morning. Someone, probably a milkman, was in a hurry to finish his rounds. Once she had settled on this explanation, she began to find the sound reassuring, simultaneously as it was with the coming of dawn and her neighbor's resumption of activity. Eventually, a rooster cried out somewhere. Not long after came the high scrape of clogs in the street. Then the sound of Kiko opening her door, going out to the privy, and on her return, entering the sitting room, apparently to look at the clock. By, by this time, the oil in the alcove lamp was too low for the short wick to reach. Oyone was surrounded by darkness. The light from Kiko's lamp in the next room flickered through the partition. Oyone called out to her. Kiko got up for soon after this. Half an hour later, it was Oyone's turn. Another half an hour after that, Sosuke too at last got up. On work days, Oyone would come around at the proper time and say to him, You better get up now." On Sundays and holidays, she would say instead, "Why don't you get up?" Today, however, with the incident in the night still on his mind, he was already out of bed before Oyone came to wake him. He immediately slid open the shutters and looked out towards the foot of the embankment. From below, Sosuke could see the frost-melting sun filtering through the bamboo stalks, which were still in the frozen grip of early morning, and bathing the crest of embankment in warm light. A couple of feet below the crest, where the embankment sloped most steeply, with withered grass was ripped and gouged, exposing to Sosuke astonished eyes patches of raw red earth. Then, in a direct line down this post, just beyond where he stood at the veranda's edge, he saw that the ground had been broken up. The ground had been broken up and the frost crystals smashed. Perhaps a large dog had tumbled down from the top, he surmised. But then, he decided even a very large dog couldn't have made such a mess. Sosuke fetched his clogs from the front of the house and quickly stepped down from the veranda. The privy jutted out right there at an angle from the veranda, squeezing the already narrow yard into a very cramped defile for a few paces. Oyone fussed about this corner. Every time the night soil gathered by. "Really do need here," she said, but her husband always scoffed at her worry. Beyond this tight spot, a slender path led around to the kitchen. Formerly there had stood here a hedge of half-dead cryptomeria shrubs that served to mark their garden off from their neighbors, but some time ago the gardener, sent by the landlord to make improvements, had removed the rotted-out hedge entirely, replacing this barrier with a slanted wooden fence full of knots that ran alongside the path to the kitchen door. In addition to receiving little sunlight, this area was where the rain poured down from the roof spout, all of which helped the begonias to thrive here in the summer. At their peak, the foliage was so dense it all it all but choked off the path, a sight that had alarmed the couple during the first summer in the house. But when Oyone thought of how the begonia's roots had survived for years beneath the only recently removed hedge, and how, long after the manor house had been razed, the plants still sent forth their seeds in their proper season, she exclaimed with joy, "They really are lovely!" Stepping into the frost, Sosuke reveled in the memories conjured up by this out-of-the-way nook which never saw the sun. Then his gaze was arrested by a spot on the narrow path. He stopped in his tracks. There ahead of him lay a writing box of gilded black lacquer. The contents were spread out over the frost as if delivered to this place intentionally and then abandoned. But the cover lay a few feet away, upside down and wedged against the base of the fence, as though fastened to it, revealing the lid's brightly patterned paper lining. Among the various letters, notes, and the like strewn about at random, there was a particularly long scroll of writing. The first 2 feet had been unfurled, the rest crumpled into a ball like so much rubbish. Sosuke took a closer look at the underside and smiled wryly. Human feces clung to the wad of paper. Having gathered them into a pile of paper scattered across the ground and placed them into the lacquer box, he carried it just as it was, covered with mud and ice, as far as the kitchen door. Sliding open the shoji, he called out to Kiyo and handed her the box. Not quite believing what she saw, Kiyo made a face and took the box. Oyone was in the parlor, dusting. Sosuke, his hands folded inside his kimono, then made the rounds of the various points of entry, the front gate, the vestibules, and so on, but failed to find anything out of the ordinary. At length he came back inside. No sooner did he sit down in his accustomed place in the sitting room hibachi than he called for Oyone in a loud voice. "Where have you been?" she asked, emerging from the parlor, "and so soon after getting up." "Listen. The noise you heard close to the bed last night, it wasn't a dream after all. It was a thief. Sorry. What you heard was the sound of him tumbling down from the Sakai's place into our garden. When I went out back to look around, I found this writing box with letters and whatnot scattered all over the place. To top it off, he left what you might call his personal calling card on the way out." Sosuke removed 2 or 3 letters from the box and showed them to Oyone. They were all addressed to Sakai. Oyone, who was still half kneeling beside him, was astonished. "Do you suppose there were other things stolen from the Sakai? Do you suppose there were other things stolen from Sakai-san?" he asked. "Yes, I would imagine there were," he said, folding his arms against his chest. Having said all of that could be said at this stage, the couple left the writing box where it was and turned to breakfast. But even as they wielded the chopsticks, the burglary was foremost on their minds. Oyone boasted of her keen ear and quick wits. For his part, Sosuke pronounced himself fortunate not to be so keen-eared or quick-witted. "That was all very well for you to say," Oyone retorted. "But what if, instead of the Sakai's, it had been our house? With you dead to the world like that, what would have happened to us?" Not about to let her have the last word, Sosuke replied, "There isn't the slightest worry of anyone bothering to break into our place." Hearing this, Kiyo poked her head from the kitchen and in a tone of genuine delight and said, "Just think what a fuss there would have been if they had got their hands on Mr. Nonaka's new coat. What a blessing that the Sakai's got robbed and not us." Sosuke and Oyone were at loss for a response. Even with breakfast finished, there was still time to spare before Sosuke had to leave for work. Conscious that The Sakai household must be in great turmoil. He decided to deliver the writing box himself. Although the box was gilded and the leaf had been applied over the black lacquer in a in a simple tortoiseshell pattern, it did not appear to be much of a monetary value. Oyone wrapped in a furoshiki of brightly colored striped silk. The cloth proved too small to be bound up in the usual way, so she drew all four corners together and tied the opposite ends in two square knots in the middle. Clutched in Sosuke's hands, it looked like an ordinary gift of box sweets. In relation to their parlor, the Sakai household stood directly above them atop the embankment. Yet, in order to reach the landlord's front gate, Sosuke had to walk half a block down the street, climb up a steep slope, and then walk back in the direction from which he came. Approaching by the way of stones set in the grass alongside a handsome hedge, he entered the gate. The house was submerged in a preternatural silence. Since seeing that the frosted glass door to the was vestibule, sorry. Seeing that the frosted glass door to the vestibule was closed, he rang the bell several times. Perhaps it was out of order. No one appeared. He was obliged to go around to the kitchen door, where he was again confronted with a closed double-paneled shoji with frosted glass. From inside came the sound of dishes being handled. Opening the door, he found a scullery maid crouched down on the wooden floor next to a gas-powered ceramic grill. Unwrapping the writing box, he addressed her. "I believe this belongs here. I found it this morning behind my house, where it seems to have fallen, and I have come to return it." "Oh, I see. Well, thank you," the woman murmured and carried the box over to the far edge of the kitchen floor, from where she summoned another woman, apparently a housemaid. After a whispered consultation, the box was passed to the housemaid, who cast a glance towards Sosuke and then quickly retreated inside. No sooner had she disappeared than a girl of about 12 with a round face and large eyes came running up, followed by a younger girl, evidently her sister. With matching ribbons in their hair, their faces appeared side by side at the threshold of the kitchen. Staring at Sosuke, they whispered to each other something about robber. Now that he had handed over the writing box, he felt he had no further business here, did not need to speak to the Sakais, and hastened to take his leave. "I guess the box does belong here," he said. That's that then." His remark, however, only succeeded in flustering the scullery maid, who seemed to know nothing about it. Just then, the housemaid reappeared. "Please follow me," she said with a deep bow, and it was Sosuke's turn to feel somewhat ill at ease. As she kept repeating her invitation with exquisite courtesy, his discomfort finally gave way to annoyance. At this juncture, the master of the house appeared himself. The landlord's ruddy, jowly face presented the prosperous look that Sosuke had been led to expect, but contrary to Oyone's description, did not lack for whiskers. Beneath the man's nose there was a well-trimmed moustache. His cheeks and chin, however, were shaved clean. "My, what a lot of trouble we have caused you," he said to Sosuke, the corners of his eyes crinkling with goodwill. Clad in a splash pattern robe, he knelt on the wooden floor as he queried his visitor about various details, with a demeanor that did not appear in the least ruffled. Sosuke gave him a condensed version of everything that had happened between the previous evening and this morning, then ventured to inquire if anything besides the writing box had been stolen. The landlord replied to the effect that a gold-covered pocket watch had been taken from his desk, in a tone as unperturbed as if it were someone else who had been robbed. Indeed, he showed much more interest in the particulars of Sosuke's account than in the watch. Had the thief from the start intended to make his escape down the embankment, or in his haste had he rather fallen down it accidentally? Such questions Sosuke, of course, could not answer. At this point, The same housemaid returned bearing tea and cigarettes, and still further delayed Sosuke's departure. His host then produced a cushion that he insisted Sosuke sit on and proceeded to describe the arrival of the detective early that morning. The, 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 the detective judged that the perpetrator must have sneaked onto the property the previous evening and hid, perhaps in the storage shed. The kitchen door had no doubt been his point of entry into the main house. It appeared that he had then entered the sitting room after using a match to light a candle that he stuck into a small container found in the kitchen, and then on noticing the mother and children asleep in the next room, passed along the corridor and into the landlord's study. While the thief busied himself here, the youngest in the family, a born infant, woke up crying for milk, whereupon the thief seemed to have fled out into the garden from the study floor. If only our dog had been on the scene, said the landlord regretfully, but but he took sick a few days ago, and so he had been at the veterinarian's. When Sosuke commiserated, his host launched into a detailed description of the dog's breed and pedigree, the occasional hunting expeditions in which he had taken part of, and so on. You see, he's to hunt, but he suffered from a nervous ailment for some time and needed some rest. I suppose it has to do with the snipe hunting I do every autumn and winter, when he has to spend 2 to 3 hours at a time to his hips in the wet fields. That can't have done him any good, I'm sure. The man, with apparently unlimited time at his disposal, went on and on while Sosuke, having responded with only, "Oh my," here and "Is that so?" there, finally, had no choice but to get up in the middle of a conversation. "I'm afraid it's time off to work as usual for me," he announced, at which his host, as if such an eventuality had only just dawned upon him, apologized for having detained him for so long. He then thanked Sosuke in advance for any further involvement that the detective might require of him in the course of the investigation. "Please come over again, just for a chat," he said cordially. "And perhaps I might just drop in on you sometimes. These days I seem to have a bit of a time on my hands." By the time Sosuke passed back through the landlord's gates and hurried home, it was already half an hour past the time he normally left for work. "Oh my god, where have you been?" asked Oyone nervously as she met him at the door. "I must say, that Sakai fellow is very easygoing," he said, quickly disrobing and changing into his business suit. "I suppose that kind of leisure comes with money." That's the end of chapter 7. And that's very true. Something leisure, like come with money. Sometimes that kind of leisure is much money. Having the time to like relax and like just enjoy yourself on a daily basis. Oh God, Jesus! It scared me. Now it's. Dun. static calling. Anyway, I don't know if I'm gonna. If I don't know there's gonna be a raid tonight, but I'll be right back real quick. Just now the rain was so heavy, crazy heavy. We can go chapter 8 now. Well, if my statics are not gonna raid tonight, I'm just gonna try to finish everything. Crazy. It's so hard to it's it's so hard to run that thing. Give me a second. I think it's just like uh, oh my god. Sorry. I think it's just some kind of a greed. I think
I think people just want to join multiple statics to like do multiple things. I feel like it shouldn't be that way. Just focus on one thing and just do on one thing. I don't know, that's just me. My opinion. You know, everyone have their way of doing things, and I have my way of doing things, and I always feel like I always feel like oh, what do I know? What do I know? Which area this song is from? Wait, what? What song is that? Wait, hang on, let me check. You mean the song from just now that I switched off? Uh, this one? This one? Oh, it's not a game. It's actually uh copyright free song. I only yeah. It's a copyright free song. Nice. But does it sound like I don't remember it because I can't hear it myself. So I don't know. Anyway, let's go back to reading. Yeah, exactly the horn, right? Yeah, I know. Yeah, anything that has like a flute or a horn, that kind of thing. It's like very, very, very like PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2 song, like game songs, sound songs. Well, anyway, I've been talking about chapter 8, but haven't been reading about chapter 8. Hang on. Um, we should have a raid at like 8 p.m. today, but two person already dropped out from the static because it clashed with their other statics. Unfortunate, but it is isn't fun all the time. But how do you find it? But anyway, let's read. Let's just be merry. Be merry. Again, chapter 8 of The Gate by Natsume Soseki. Koroku-san, should we start with the sitting room or the parlor? Oyone asked. Now that Koroku had finally moved into his brother's house some 4 or 5 days earlier, it devolved on him to help out with today's repapering of the shoji. He had had some experience with this when still living with his uncle, joining Yasunosuke in replacing the paper in the sliding room doors to his own room. That project had commenced in more or less proper fashion with mixing the glue and in trays and applying in the trowels. But once the two re-prepared, no, sorry, repapered, not prepared. Jesus, I can't read. But once the two repapered panels were good and dry, and they went on to replace them, they could not fit them back into their grooves. He and Yanosuke's effort had come to grief in a second time, tackling another set of shoji at the behest of his aunt. They soaked the frames in order to remove the old paper, with the result that the frames were seriously warped in drying, and once again they had trouble getting them back in place. "Ne-san," said Koroku as he tore away the old paper, starting on the sitting room panels. "You have to be extremely cautious when you repaper shoji, or you'll make a mess of it. You absolutely must not soak them." The garden just below this veranda was bordered on the right by the wall of the six-mat room that Koroku was using, and by the vestibule, which jutted out on the left. These borders, along with the veranda and the outer hedge that ran parallel to it, formed what was in effect a square enclosure. On dew-laden mornings, the couple would take great pleasure in this enclosed garden, which in the summer months was covered with cosmos plants and adorned with morning glories, curled about the slender bamboo stakes that they had placed at the base of the hedge. Sometimes, as soon as they had gotten up, they excitedly counted the numbers of blossoms that had opened that day, but from the autumn through the winter all shrubs and flowers here would wither completely, leaving what resembled small desert, so barren as to elicit pity. With his back to this square plot, where a thick of frost had formed, Koroku energetically stripped the old paper off the shoji. His neck and close-cropped head, with each gust he felt the urge to retreat from the exposed veranda to his six-mat room. He worked silently, his hands red, wringing out a rag and a bucket of water and wiping the shoji slats clean. "You must be cold, you poor thing. And we certainly didn't need this chilly drizzle." Oyone was all sympathy as she poured a steady trickle of hot water from the kettle to soften up the glue prepared the night before. Inwardly, Koroku despised doing chores like this. He wielded his rag in a spirit verging on self-mortification, a spirit rooted in the position to which his circumstances had recently reduced him. In the past, he recalled, when it had fallen to him to perform this very same task at his uncle's, it had been a far from unpleasant diversion. This time around, however, he felt coerced. Those around him regarded him as unqualified for any other type of work. The cold out on the veranda only added insult to injury. Koroku then could not manage even some simple good-natured reply to his sister-in-law. What flashed across his mind at this moment was the time he had been out for a stroll with a law student who lived in the same boarding house as he did. They had stopped at Shiseido, where the housemaid proceeded to splurge close to 5 yen on nothing but 3 bars of imported soaps and some toothpaste. It had struck him then that there was no good reason in the world why he in particular should find himself in such a straitened circumstances. He could only pity his brother and sister-in-law for being content to live out their lives in penury. Penury. Oh, what does that mean? Learn a new word today. Penury. E Penury. Extreme poverty? I don't think Soseki and Oyone are living in poverty. They have a maid. They live in a few like I think the brother just wants to be a rich boy. Thing. Spoiled. He could only pity his brother and sister-in-law for being content to live out their lives in penury. From Koroku's point of view, there was something terribly supine about a lifestyle in which one had to worry over something like whether to buy the Mino paper or settle for something less strong. "This stuff tears easily," said Koroku as he unfurled a foot's length, a foot's length, the shoji paper, held it up, held it, oh my god, held it up the light, and gave it 2 or 3 slaps, good and hard. Oh? Oyone replied, gently dabbing glue on the shoji slats with her brush. But we don't have children. It will probably hold up. The two of them took hold of a length of paper that had been spliced together, one on each end, tried to stretch it out so as to leave no slack. But from time to time, Moroko's face would register annoyance, at which Oyone would grow hesitant and, razor in hand, end up trimming her end unevenly. As a result, there have been a number of conspicuous bulges in the already completed portions. Oyone mournfully surveyed one newly repapered shoji propped up against the shutter case. If only she could have worked with her husband instead of Koroku, she thought. There seem to be a few wrinkles, she said. I'm afraid I don't have the knack for this. Don't be silly. Your brother is no better, and besides, he's a lot lazier than you. Koroku did not reply. Taking a cup of water that Kiyo had brought from the kitchen, he stood in front of the propped up shoji and blew a fine mist on the paper until the whole surface was moist. By the time they were repapering the second panel, the one he had sprayed was nearly dry, and most of the wrinkles smoothed out. When they had finished the third panel, Koroku announced that his back was bothering him. Oyone, meanwhile, had had a headache since the early morning. Let's do one more and finish with the sitting room before we take a break, he said. By the time they were done with the sitting room, it was past noon. They sat down to lunch together. During these past several days, with Sosuke away at the office, Oyone had not failed to keep Koroku's company at the lunch table. This was the first time since she and Sosuke had joined their lives together, and she had had a companion for lunch other than her husband. All these years, whenever her husband was absent, it was her habit to eat alone. To sit here face to face with her brother-in-law, then making conversation as she served the rice, was most discomfiting. It was hard enough when the maid was on duty in the kitchen, but now, with Kiyo neither to be seen nor heard, Oyone felt all the more constrained. True, Oyone was much the older of the two, and the character of their relationship in the past could hardly be expected to engender that peculiar erotic tension bound to arise between when two people of the opposite sex thrown together in a similarly novel situation. Still, she wondered to herself if she would ever lose this sensation of being stifled by Koroku's presence, which was all the more perturbing for being so unexpected. All she could do was to keep up a steady conversation throughout the meal in order to avoid uneasy silences. Unfortunately, Unfortunately, in his present state of mind, Koroku could summon neither the composure nor the discernment to engage his sister-in-law's gracious manner with any enthusiasm. So, Koroku-san, was the food at the boarding house any good? To such questions, he could no longer respond as he did when he was still at the boarding house and paying them a visit, with some ready off-the-cuff quip. And when at a loss for reply, he would confine himself to something like, "No, not particularly." His words struck Oyone as vague and unforthcoming, and she would worry that she was not being welcoming enough. In turn, her reaction, though unspoken, would communicate itself in some fashion to Koroku. Today, however, with her headache, Oyone felt incapable of making the usual effort with her brother-in-law as they sat together at the table, and she was especially loath to do so only to be rebuffed. And so they finished their lunch having exchanged even fewer words than while they have been busy with the repapering. And yet, thanks perhaps to the experience they had acquired, the work in the afternoon progressed more smoothly Then in the morning, they nevertheless felt further apart than they had before, but before lunch. They were both much oppressed by the cold. When they first arose that morning, the weather was so fine that the sky appeared to be moving away from them, carrying the sun along with it. Yet, just when it took on its deepest hue, clouds suddenly began to form and block out every ray, as if poised to blanket the darkening landscape with powdery snow. The two of them took turns warming their hands over the charcoal brazier. I gather that my brother will be getting a raise in the new year, Koroku suddenly asked Oyone. Oyone, in the midst of wiping glue off her hands with some scraps of paper thrown across the tatami, looked dumbfounded. Whatever gave you the idea? Well, it said in the paper, next year there's to be an across-the-board salary increase for civil servants. It was not until Koroku went on to explain in some detail that Oyone, who had not heard a word of this, became convinced that it must be true. Well, it's about time, said. We can't get by on what they are paying now. No one can. Why, since we came to Tokyo, the price of a fish fillet alone has doubled. It was Koroku's turn to be dumbfounded, not having been at all aware of the fish of the price until hearing Oyone's comment. The rate of inflation simply astounded him. Now that Koroku's curiosity had been somewhat piqued, the conversation began to flow more smoothly. Oyone repeated an account by their landlord as related to her by Sosuke how cheap things had been. He was still in his late teens. A heaping bowl of plain noodles had cost him 8 rin. A bowl of one topping, or another 2.5 sen. A full portion of ordinary beef was 4 sen, of choice beef 6 sen. An afternoon at the vaudeville performance cost only 3 or 4 sen. An average student lifestyle then could be maintained on a 7 yen per month allowance from home, while a 10 yen allowance would have been afforded considerable luxury. In those days, could have gone through college without any worries, said Oyone. Yes, and you and my brother could have lived very well then, couldn't you? Replied Koroku. By the time they had finished repapering the parlor shoji, it was after 3. It would not be long before Sosuke came home, and there were preparations to be made for dinner. Having decided to call it a day, they put away the glue, razors, and other things. Koroku gave his body a single vigorous stretch, and his head a good pounding with his fist. Thank you so much. You must be exhausted, said Oyone solicitously. But it was not so much fatigue or dull pangs of hunger that Koroku felt. He ate some sweets that Oyone took down from the shelf after explaining that the Sakai had sent them in thanks for returning the writing box. Then he made him some tea. Is this Sakai a university graduate? Koroku asked. Yes, or so I gather. Koroku sipped his tea, puffed on his cigarette, and asked, Hasn't my brother said anything to you about his race? Not a word, said Oyone. It must be nice to be like him, not worrying about anything. Oyone made no attempt at a reply. Koroku stood up and wandered off to his room, but soon came back, a charcoal brazier in his hand, saying that the fire had died out. Imposing on the hospitality of his brother and sister-in-law, and still officially on leave of absence from school, he put much stock in Yasunosuke's assurances that soon he would be able to help him, and viewed these arrangements as only temporary. The end of chapter. Oroku sounds very entitled. Why are people like see entitled people are the same across the generation? This is 1910s. 1910s. Yeah. Feel like there's always one always one sibling that's like very into everything. I guess in maybe not all, but like maybe mostly like in Asian countries, it's always one that acts like the whole world revolve around them. It's true in my household. Okay, um, that was the end of chapter 8. We are going to read chapter 9. Chapter 9, The Gate.
by Natsume Soseki.
From the seed of the writing box's recovery, an unlikely relationship had sprouted between Sosuke and his landlord. Previously, their dealings having been confined to monthly dispatching of Kiyo with the rent payment and subsequent delivery of a receipt. Any semblance of neighborly friendliness had been absent, as if a family from abroad had dwelled up there. On the afternoon of the day that Sosuke returned the box, the detective turned up, as Sakai had predicted, to examine the area behind the couple's house at the foot of the embankment. The detective was accompanied by Sakai, giving Oyone her first look at the man she had heard so much about. In addition to the moustache that she had originally been led not to expect, she was mildly surprised by the uncommonly polite manner in which he spoke, even when addressing her. Sakai-san doesn't. Sakai-san actually does have a moustache, doesn't he? She noted to Sosuke with some emphasis when they were alone again. 2 days later, a maid descended on them, bearing a magnificent basket of treats and Sakai's calling card. She thanked them for their kindness, adding as she took her leave, "The master hopes to call on you himself in due time." That evening, Sosuke opened the basket and stuffed his mouth with one of the toasted sweet dumplings he found inside. Giving presents like this, well, he can't be all that stingy. Whoever told you he wouldn't let other children play on the swing must have been lying. Yes, that can't be right, Oyane agreed. Despite this new cordiality in the couple's relationship with their landlord since the burglary, neither Sosuke nor Oyone entertained any notion of pursuing greater familiarity in this quarter. They were not so bold as to put themselves forward in the name of sociability or affability, and were not the sort to engage in calculations of potential self-interest arising from such a relationship. Wow, I can relate with them. By their lights, then, it was only to be expected that the natural course of things, time would slip by quickly with no efforts made by them to tend this new relationship, which would soon enough revert to the same footing on which the two parties have been before. The Sakais atop the embankment, Sosuke and Oyone below, as far apart emotionally as they were topographically. But 3 days later, around sundown, Sakai unexpectedly showed up at the couple's door, wrapped in a warm-looking cloak with an otter skin collar. Otter skin? Sorry. Otter skin? What? Not used to having guests simply drop by in the evening. They at first reacted with near consternation. When Sakai had taken a seat in the parlor, he proceeded to express sincere gratitude for their recent help, and unchaining his gold and case pocket watch from his white crepe sash for them to see, said, "Thanks to you, the stolen item was recovered." Since it was the law, He had reported the theft to the police, but the watch was an old one, making it easier for him to accept the loss. Then suddenly, yesterday, a small package arrived, bearing no return address and containing the stolen watch neatly wrapped. The thief must have found it too hot to handle, or not worth the risk for the money he could have get it for, so decided that he had no choice but to give it back. Whatever the case, definitely unusual, said Sakai with a laugh. But for me, at any rate, it was the writing box that was of real value. Then, by way of an explanation, he confided, "You see, it was bestowed on my grandmother when she was in attendance at court, so it's kind of a family heirloom." Steering the conversation this way and that, Sakai stayed on that evening for almost 2 hours. Neither Sosuke, who sat with him, nor Oyone, who listened in the sitting room, could fail to be impressed by the range of topics he touched on. This is just introvert versus extrovert, I guess. He certainly gets around. He certainly gets around, they commented after he had left. "He's got all the time in the world on his hands," Sosuke replied. Next day, on his way home from work, Sosuke got off the streetcar and was walking down the side street near the furniture store, when he caught a glimpse of Sakai's overcoat with the familiar otter skin collar attached. Sakai, standing in a position that presented his profile to Sosuke, was engaged in a conversation with the proprietor, who was peering up at Sakai through large spectacles he had not paused to remove. Just as Sosuke, not wishing to interrupt, was about to pass by in silence, Sakai shifted his gaze towards the street. "Well, hello! Thanks for last night. On your way home now?" Addressed by the landlord in this hail fellow well-met man. Sosuke could not simply forge ahead with a token nod. Slackening his pace, he doffed his hat, at which Sakai, his business evidently concluded, advanced from the storefront. "Out for a bit of shopping?" asked Sosuke. "Hardly," Sakai replied dismissively as he fell in step with Sosuke for the walk home. After they had gone 40 or 50 feet, Sakai declared, "That geezer is a real crook, sorry. That geezer is a real cook. Crook! 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 That geezer is a real crook." Why did I skip the R? What's wrong with me? Geezer is a real crook. I was just giving him a piece of my mind for trying to pass off a fake kazan on me. This was the first indication that Sosuke had received that Sakai shared the pastime common among the well-to-do of dabbling in rare objects. It then crossed his mind that he really should have showed the recently sold Hoitsu to someone like him before putting it up on the market. "Does that dealer know a lot about calligraphy and painting?" Sosuke asked. "Not really. In fact, he's downright ignorant about the lot. All you have to do is take a glance at his shop. You won't find anything that smacks of an antique. As it is, he's come a long way, seeing as he started off as a junk man." Sakai apparently knew a great deal about the man's background. The Sakai family, according to the local greengrocer, had ranked sufficiently high under the Tokugawa regime, the Tokugawa regime, to be accorded some titular governorship, titular governorship, and had the most impressive family pedigree in the area. They had not followed the last shoguns to the last shogun to Sunbu at the time of the old regime's collapse, or had they gone off only to re-emerge soon from exile? Sosuke had been told the details, but he could no longer recollect them. Sakai went on to dredge up the tales involving the junkman from their boyhood days. Even as kids, he was a troublemaker, you know. He was the local bully and was always picking fights. How on earth? Sakai wondered aloud. Had the man imagined he could foist a fake kazan on Sakai? Well, since we've given his family some business from my father's time on, once in a while he'll just turn up with some odd item, Sakai explained with a chuckle. He's more than he's more than makes up for his lack of taste with a huge capacity for greed. He's a real piece of work. Of that, his appetite was whetted when he got me to buy a Hoitsu screen. Sosuke was startled, but not wanting to interrupt, held his tongue. Sakai went on about how emboldened by this one sale, the furniture dealer had shown up regularly with scrolls and paintings that he himself made, no pretense of knowing anything about, and how, under the misapprehension that it was real, he prominently displayed a medieval Korean ceramic bowl that had in fact been made in Osaka, except maybe for a dining table or say one of those factory made iron kettles. I wouldn't buy anything in that shop, cautioned. They had reached the top of the slope. From here, Sakai would be turning right, while Sosuke had to proceed down on the right on the other side. Sosuke wanted to accompany Sakai a little farther in order to ask him more about the screen, but going out his way like that would appear odd, he realized, and so he took his leave. Would you mind if I paid a vi- Would you mind if I paid you a visit sometime soon? Sosuke asked. Not at all, Sakai replied cordially. Although the day had been perfectly calm and the sun had shone brightly, Oyone came home to find Oyone waiting for him in the parlor, where claiming that the house was still piercing cold, she had set up the portable kotatsu in the middle of the room and hung his change of clothes over it. It was the first time in this winter that the kotatsu had been out to use by day. Although they had been using it at night for some time now, they stored it by day in the six-mat room. But why did you drag it out in the middle of the parlor today? Sosuke asked. Well, we're not expecting any guests, so it shouldn't matter. Koroku is using the six-mat room after all, and it would just be in his way there. This brought home to Sosuke, as if, for the first time, that Koroku was here to stay. He did up the sash around the warm machine-woven robe that Oyone helped him drape over his undershirt and said, True, this is our frigid zone here. We'll have to install a fixed kotatsu just to make it bearable. If the tatami in Koroku's six-mat room were less than pristine, the room itself, with its southern and eastern exposure, was the warmest spot in their house. After a few sips of hot tea Oyone had brought him, he asked, Is Koroku home? It was of course certain that his brother was there, but not the faintest sound could be heard from the six-mat room. It seemed impossible that there could be anyone inside. As Oyone rose to call Koroku, Sosuke stopped her. There was no need to speak to him right now. Then, burrowing under the quilt attached to the portable kotatsu, he lay stretched out on his side. Twilight had already made its presence felt in his room, where the shoji is all faced the steep embankment. His arm pillowed beneath his head, simply gazed into the dark, confined space, his mind blank. The noise made by Oyone and Kiyo in the kitchen sounded as remote to him as stirrings of faceless neighbors. Before long, the room was shrouded in darkness. He could see only the pale white of the shoji, and yet he kept perfectly still. He moved not a muscle, not even to call for a lamp. When Sosuke emerged from the darkness to take his place in the dinner table, Koroku also appeared out of the six-mat room and sat across his brother. Apologizing for her forgetfulness, Oyone went to close the parlor shutters. Sosuke felt an impulse to point out to Koroku that as evenings come on, it might be nice if he helped his busy sister-in-law a bit by lighting lamps, closing shutters, and the like. But then, not wishing to say anything jarring to one so recently arrived under their roof, decided to say nothing at all. Having waited for Oyone, the brothers picked up their bowls as soon as she returned to the table. Sosuke took this opportunity to tell them about his chance encounter with Sakai outside the furniture shop on the way home, and how Sakai brought a Hoitsu screen from the furniture dealer with an oversized glasses. Well, Oyone murmured in surprise. After scanning her husband's face for a moment, she said, "It must have been our screen, no doubt about it." Koroku was silent at first, but once he had heard enough of the couple's exchange for the context to become clear, he asked, "So, how much did you sell for it?" Oyene darted at a glance at her husband before answering the question. As soon as the dinner was over, Koroku went straight to his room. Sosuke returned to the kotatsu in the parlor. After a while, Oyone came in to take the chill off her feet. In the course of their chat, they agreed that it would be a good idea to call on the Sakais next Saturday or Sunday and have a good look at the screen. The following Sunday, as was his habit, Sosuke frittered away most of the morning, luxuriating in this once-a-week opportunity to sleep in. Oyone said that she felt sluggish again and leaned back against the rim of the brazier, too weary, it seemed, to do anything. It crossed Sosuke's mind that at times like this she used to retreat for the morning in the six-mat room when it was available. And then he realized with a stab of remorse that in assigning the room to Koroku, he had in effect deprived her of the one place of refuge. He urged her to pull out the bedding and lie down in the parlor if she felt poorly, but she demurred. In that case, why not set up the portable kotatsu again? He persisted, saying that in fact he would like to share it with her. And in the end, she, he had Kiyo get out of the quilt and frame and set them in the parlor. Koroku, having gotten up slightly before Sosuke had gone out somewhere and was not seen for the rest of the morning, Sosuke made no effort to grill Oyone about his brother's whereabouts. Lately, he had been trying to spare Oyone the embarrassment of having to respond to such questions. Better that she castigated her brother-in-law's conduct openly, he sometimes thought. He could then rebuff her accusations or commiserate as the situation demanded. Even at noontime, Oyone was still resting by the kotatsu. Thinking that she was best left in peace, Sosuke quietly informed Kiyo in the kitchen that he was off to the landlord's, draped in sleeveless Inverness style cape, style cape over his everyday kimono, and went outside. After being cooped up all morning in the gloomy parlor, Sosuke found his spirits rising again. Sorry, found his spirits rising once he reached the street. The muscles beneath his bare skin taut against the cold wind. He reveled in the wintry sensation in instant bodily contraction, which led him to reflect as he walked along that it was not good for Oyone to stay indoors all the time like this, that as soon as the weather warmed up a bit, he must get her out, fresh air, before her health was seriously affected. Passing through the Sakai's gate, noticed a bright red swatch incongruous at this season tucked in the hedge that separated the approaches in the main entrance to the kitchen door. On closer inspection, he discovered it to be the doll's tiny nightgown, fastened to the branch of the hedge by means of bamboo skewer inserted through the little sleeve. How resourceful, he thought, admiring the expert way in which it had been hung, and charming to boot. Sosuke, who had no experience at all of being a father, let alone of having raised girls to the stage where they could manage such a neat trick, stood there for a while and gazed at the tiny red nightgown drying out nicely in the sun. He thought that it brought to his mind the red shelves with their array of 5 musician stalls, which more than 2 decades ago, his parents had set up for his new deceased young sister, along the elegantly shaped rice cakes and the festive, cloudy cordial that looked sweet but actually tasted bitter. Sakai was at home, but Sosuke was asked by the maid to wait in another room until the master had finished his meal. No sooner had he been seated than there came from the next room the chattering voices of persons responsible for the laundering of the little nightgown. When the maid slid open a panel to bring in some tea, Sosuke could see behind her two pairs of wide open eyes peering out in his direction. Later, when she carried in a brazier, a different face presented itself. All this being quite new to him, it seemed that each time the panel opened there was a complete change of faces, and he could not keep track of how many children he had seen. When the maid had at least ceased her coming and going, one of the children slid the thickly papered panel open ever so slightly, no more than an inch, and in the gap revealed in her shining black eyes. Beguiled, Sosuke beckoned her slightly. At this, the door was slammed shut, and just behind it, a chorus of 3 or 4 voices erupted in peals of laughter. Presently, one girl piped up, "All right, let's play house again." Which another, evidently an older sister, replied, "Okay, but today we'll play house foreign style." Now that means, she went on to explain, Tosaku-san will be called Papa and Yukiko-san Mama. That's silly. Talking about your old mother like stepmom. He heard another voice giggling with delight. Then another voice, "But what about me? I always have to be Obaba. So you have to tell us what the word that is, or that is too." "For Obaba," explained the older sister, "just Obaba is fine." There ensued a prolonged exchange of effusive greetings. "Please forgive the intrusion, but is anybody home? And where might you have come from, sir?" Interspersed with attempts to mimic a telephone ringing and the like. To Sosuke, to Sosuke's ear, it all sounded both delightful and exotic. God, I almost read it as erotic. Ugh. Sorry, it's exotic, okay? No pedos here. Just then, Sosuke heard the sound of approaching footsteps. No doubt the master of the house. As soon as they reached the next room, a voice was heard commanding, "This is no place for you to be fooling around. We have a guest. Now go back to where you belong." Immediately, a little boy could be heard in protest. "No, Daddy, I won't. Buy me a nice big horsey, please, or I won't go." The boy seemed very young. His words were not well formed, and they came out in awkward spurts, rendering his protest far from forceful. Sosuke found this particularly charming. By the time Sakai sat down with Sosuke and apologized for keeping him waiting for so long, the children had gone off somewhere else. "Such high spirits! It's wonderful!" Sosuke exclaimed in all sincerity, but Sakai seemed to think that he was only being polite. "No, I'm afraid their behavior is pretty wild, as you saw," he responded apologetically, then proceeded to recite the many needs of children and the endless trouble they have caused. There was the time, for example, when they adorned the alcove with an elegant Chinese basket they had stuffed full of charcoal briquettes, and another when they filled a pair of laced-up boots he had just made with water and left some goldfish swimming around in them. This prank struck Sosuke as highly inventive. And then Sakai continued, with most of his children being girls. There was the constant fuss about new clothes, and to make matters worse, if you went on a trip for so long as a couple of weeks, they looked as though they had grown at least an inch when he returned. With one thing or another, he felt he had his back against the wall, even now. But then, all too soon, they would be getting married, and the preparation would not only be ferociously hectic, but but no doubt ruinous. Sorry, financially ruinous. The childless Sosuke took all this in without much sympathy. On the contrary, observing how for all Sakai's complaints about his children, his face betrayed no trace of suffering at all, he felt envious. Having waited for an opportune moment, Sosuke now asked his host if he might have a glimpse at the screen that had been mentioned the other day. Sakai agreed with alacrity. Clapping his hands loudly, he summoned a manservant and ordered him to bring the screen over from the storehouse. Turning to Sosuke, he said, "It was standing right here until just a couple of days ago, but then the children, them again, decided it was fun to hide behind the screen and fool around. So I was worried it might get damaged and had it put away in the storehouse." Sosuke regretted having put Sakai to this bother and wished he had not mentioned the screen in the first place. In truth, he entertained only the mildest curiosity about the screen's fate. After all, once a thing becomes the property of someone else, establishing whether or not it had originally belonged to one was of absolutely no consequence, practically speaking. Regardless of any second thoughts about the matter, however, the screen, as he requested, was presently brought out from the storeroom, trundled upon the veranda, and set before his eyes. As expected, it proved to be the very one that had until recently stood in his own parlor. The realization did not evoke in him any strong reaction at all. Nevertheless, to view it here, surrounded as it now by the luster of the tatami on which they were sitting on, the fine grain of the wooden ceiling, the objects in the alcove, the patterns in the sliding partitions, to which would be added to the elaborate care involved in its being borne in the storeroom by two hand servants, all of this Sosuke had conceded, made all of this Sosuke had to concede, made the screen look 10 times more precious than when still in his possession. At a total loss for words, he went through the motions of gazing intently, as though at something new and fresh, at this thoroughly familiar object. Under the apprehension that his guest was a connoisseur, Sakai stood with one hand on the frame, shifting his glance from the screen to Sosuke's face and back again. When this failed to elicit the anticipated appraisal, he said, "The attribution is completely solid. Quality will out, they say." "Yes, of course," said Sosuke. After another pause, the host repositioned himself just behind Sosuke and launched into an appreciation of the screen, pointing at one detail or another with his finger and lecturing on the finer points. And as one might expect of someone of his extravagance, extravagance. As one might expect of someone of his extravagance. Sorry, wait. Extravagance. I'm sorry. Sorry. Sometimes when you read too much, just the words just jumble up, you know. Eh. Extravagance. He explained the artist had made lavish use of the highest quality paints, which was one of the hallmarks of his works. The coloring was truly exquisite, and so on. Remarks that all sounded quite original to Sosuke, well-worn truism though they were. After what seemed to him a decent interval, Sosuke thanked his host and returned to his seat. Sakai likewise moved back to his cushion where he started in on the screen inscription about a country slain as the sky above, and the verse's calligraphic style. Once again, Sosuke was impressed by his host's intensive interest in haiku and calligraphy. Indeed, so wide was the scope of things about which he appeared knowledgeable that Sosuke could only wonder when the man had managed to store up all this erudition, erudition in his head. Ashamed of his own ignorance, he strained to keep his responses to a bare minimum in order to give full attention to Sakai's comments. His guest, showing scant signs of interest in haiku and calligraphy, Sakai shifted the conversation back to the painting. He gracefully offered to show Sosuke any scrolls or albums among his holding that he might wish to see, not that there was anything of great distinction, he added. Sosuke indicated that regrettably he had no choice but to forego the opportunity, but incidentally, and he apologized for his bluntness. How much, he wondered, had Sakai paid for the recently acquired screen? Well, it was really like stumbling on a hidden treasure. I got it for just 80 yen, his host replied. Shall I tell him the whole story or not? Sosuke thought to himself and hesitated for a moment, but it came to him in a flash that owning up to the truth would be entertaining for the both of them. At length, he said, well, actually, and told all, from beginning to end. Sakai heard his guess out with a few little gaps of surprises along the way. At last, he said, so, it was not out of some passion for calligraphy and painting that you asked to see the screen, and burst out laughing, clearly much amused at his own mistake assumptions. At the same time, he expressed regret not having dealt this directly with Sosuke, nor having settled on a price that was still considerably less than what he had actually paid. He finished with a vehement denunciation of the furniture dealer. What a scoundrel! After this, Sosuke and Sakai fell into a kind of friendship. That was the end of chapter 9. The brothers, the shithead. But all teenagers are shithead, aren't they? Right? All the younger brother care about is I have the money to live in poverty like this. Now, continue. Chapter 10, but let me. Oh, sorry. Coffee? Okay. Oh. I like reading, like, yeah. I can do the same thing. When the hair is stuck to the front, like in my life. Okay, anyway. Okay, so now 7:30. Alright, let's go on. Let's read chapter 10 of The Gate by Natsume Soseki. Sosuke received no more visits from his aunt or cousin. He, of course, had no time to visit them in their home in Kojimachi Ward, nor, for that matter, any strong inclination to do so. Two families might be related by ties of blood, but the same sun did not shine down on both houses. Oh, I love that word. That sentence. Two families might be related by ties of blood, but the same sun did not shine down on both houses. Very good. And then let's continue. Let's continue. Sorry. God, let me restart again. Chapter 10. The Gate by Natsume Soseki. Sosuke received no more visits from his aunt or his cousin. He, of course, had no time to visit them in their home in Kojimachi Ward, nor for that matter any strong inclination to do so. The two families might be related by the ties of blood, but the same sun did not shine down on both houses. True, Koroku paid the Saekis a visit now and then for a chat, although not, it seemed, with any frequency. Upon his return from such visits, he seldom passed on to Oyone any news of his aunt or cousin. Oyone suspected that the silence might be calculated on Koroku's part, but feeling as she did that she and his aunt has very little in common, she was, if anything, quite relieved not to hear about the woman's sundry doings. Still, Oyone managed to receive occasional updates on the Saekis by listening in on conversations between Koroku and Sosuke. Just a week earlier, Koroku had told his brother how very hard Yasunosuke was working in an effort to market another invention. This one had to do with some machine that, from Koroku's sketchy account anyway, it had something to do with producing printed matter without recourse to ink. Sounded potentially very valuable. The complex nature of this process being utterly foreign to anything in her experience, Oyone simply listened in silence, as was her wont in any case. Sosuke, being a man, found his curiosity piqued by the project and responded with spirited questions about how inkless printing might be possible. Lacking any specialized knowledge on the subject, Koroku could hardly be expected to provide many details. He simply related all that he could recall from Yasunosuke's description. Basically, this new printing process, which had been recently invented in England, came down to still another novel application of electricity. One pole of an electric current gets attached to the type and the other to a sheet of paper. Then all you have to do is press the paper down against the type in flash, Koroku explained. The print is transferred to the paper surface. Ordinarily, the print is black, but with adjustment it can be changed easily enough to red or blue when color is needed, thus eliminating the time required to drying between applications, and when it is applied to printing newspapers over and above the savings on ink and rotary presses, a whole printing run requires 25% less labor than what is needed for the current process, from which you can just see how incredibly promising this business will be in the future. Once again, Koroku merely repeated what his cousin had told him. Into Koroku's recounting there crept a suggestion that Yasunosuke had already had this rosy future firmly in his grasp, and the young man's eyes seemed to gleam with reflection of his own bright future. Assured by his cousin's success, Sosuke meanwhile took in Koroku's fervent report with his customary nonchalance, and even when his brother had finished, did not interject any particular criticisms. For in truth, he felt that the purported invention appeared on the one hand perfectly plausible, on the other a complete fantasy, until his cousin's scheme played out one way or another in the real world. It was not for him either to support or to oppose it. So he's given up on the bonito boots? Oyone, who had listened in silence, spoke up for the very first time. It's not that he has given up, Koroku replied, taking on the role of a promoter for Yasunosuke's enterprises. But those would be very expensive items. No matter how useful they'll be, I gather that there just aren't enough people who could afford them. The three of them continued on this discussion for a while, but in the end, Sosuke said, no matter what line of business you are in, success just doesn't come that easy. Yes, the best success is to be rich like Sakai-san and then do whatever you like. Oyone's comment in his ears. Koroku returned to his room. Apart from these occasional reports gleaned from Koroku's visits to the Saekis, along with the couple, for the most part, had no idea how they were getting along. One day, Oyone asked Sosuke, do you suppose that every time Koroku stops by at Yasusan, he has come away with a bit of money? Why do you ask? Not having paid much attention thus far to Koroku's doings, Sosuke was startled by Oyone's sudden question. After a moment of hesitation, Oyone said, yes, well, lately when he comes home, you can tell he has been drinking. Oh, Yasusan's probably treating him in exchange for his listening to all that stuff about making a bundle on his inventions, he said with a laugh, at which the conversation broke off with nothing further said about the matter. 3 days later, Koroku again failed to come home by mealtime. The couple waited for a while, but Sosuke finally declared he was hungry, and ignoring Oyone's suggestion that he take this time to go to the bathhouse, sat down to eat. Seizing the opportunity, Oyone said, could you possibly have a talk with Koroku about his drinking? You mean he's drinking so much that I should speak to him about it? Asked Sosuke, looking somewhat alarmed. Well, no, it didn't seem all that serious, Oyone replied, now feeling obliged to shield Koroku. But in truth, he found it unnerving having Koroku coming home so red in the face during broad daylight. When she was there alone, Sosuke did not return to the subject. Inwardly, however, he began to suspect his wife might be onto something, that his brother might in fact be borrowing or at any rate accepting money from someone and indulging in drink even though he had never shown much taste for it before. The years slipped away, and nighttime steadily encroached until it laid claim to two-thirds of their day. The wind whistled fiercely, day in and day out. The mere sound of it was enough to send people into depression. Koroku simply could not bear to stay confined all day to his six-mat room. The longer he was left to his own thoughts, the lonelier he felt, until it became intolerable for him to remain there for another moment. The idea of going over to the sitting room and chatting with his sister-in-law was even less bearable. With no other alternative, he left the house and made the rounds of various friends' lodgings on foot. At first, these friends treated Koroku as of old, regaling him with the sort of anecdotes that students find amusing. But then, even after they had run out of anecdotes, Koroku would turn up for more. They concluded that he came around mainly out of boredom and a desire to hone his conversational skill. There are times when his friends went out of their way to act preoccupied with research projects or class preparations. It was a torture for Koroku to be treated this way, in the, to be treated in this fashion as a carefree idler. Yet he simply could not settle down at home for long enough to do to do any serious readings or thinking. In short, whether it is ascribed to insufficient motivation or external constraints, he was utterly incapable of the self-discipline and exertion that for a young man at his stage of life serve as a indispensable stepping stone on the path to maturity. Despite his restlessness, when there was a driving rain or when the roads were mired in mud and melting snow, even Koroku would refrain from going out, daunted by the prospect of getting soaked and muddying the socks he wore with his clogs. At such time, clearly at his wits' end, he would occasionally venture out of his room, shuffle over to the sitting room brazier, and pour himself a cup of tea. And if Oyone happened to be there, he even managed to bring himself to chat with her a bit about one thing or another. Oyone would ask him questions along the lines of how many bowls of rice dumpling and broth he wanted come New Year's, and whether he was fond of sake. As this occasion multiplied, the two of them gradually came to achieve a certain rapport. Eventually, it reached to a point where Koroku was not shy about asking some favor of his sister, as he called her, such as mending his jacket. Then, as Oyone proceeded to repair the hole in the splash-battered sleeve, he just sat there staring at her hand. When she did something like that for her husband, she was content to sew away in silence, but it was not in character to treat Koroku so casually. She made a special effort to keep up a conversation with him. At times, when, at times like this, Koroku was prone to steer the topic towards the matter so much on his mind, his uncertain future. The first couple of times the subject came up, Oyone simply offered a few words of encouragement. But really, Koroku-san, you are still so young, you know. There's a plenty of time for you to do whatever you want. To be so gloomy about the future, you should leave that to your brother. The third time around, however, she asked him, didn't Yasu-san agree to help you out one way or another in the coming year? Well, if everything works out just fine, as he says it will, sure, there'll be no problem, said Koroku, with a look that was far from confident. But, but the more I think about it, the less likely it seems to me that things will turn out the way he plans. I mean, he hasn't made much of those bonito boats. Mentally juxtaposing the utterly forlorn figure now in front of her, and the Koroku who had been coming home smelling of alcohol with the ferocious look of someone wronged, though by what or by whom it was not at all clear. Oyone found herself feeling sorry for him. At the same time, she couldn't help feeling amused. Yet it was out of genuine sympathy and not out of desire to ingratiate herself that she said, I know what you mean. If only your brother had the money, I'm sure he would do anything to help. It was the same evening, perhaps, when Koroku wrapped a cloak around his shivering frame and went out again. He came home after 8 and produced a white tubular package from his kimono sleeve and presented it to Oyone and his brother. He explained that with this cold weather a craving had come over him for buckwheat noodles, so he had bought some on his way back from the Saikis. Sorry. Oyone put on the cat Oyone put the kettle on, and mentioning something about broth, threw herself into grating a chunk of dried bonito. The couple then heard from Korku the latest news from the Saiki households. Yasunosuke weddings was to be postponed until the next spring. Negotiation for the marriage had been entered into shortly after Yasunosuke's graduation. By the time Koroku had returned from the seashore to learn that his aunt that there would be no more money for tuition, his cousin's engagement had been all but confirmed. In absence of any formal announcement, Sosuke had no idea when the negotiation had in fact been concluded. And it was only through hearing this and that from Koroku after his periodic visits to the Sayakis that he had come to suppose that the wedding would take place before the year's end. It was likewise by the way of his brother that Sosuke came to learn that the fiance's father was employed by a large company, and the family lived quite comfortably, and that the fiancé had attended the Tokyo Women's Academy. And it was Koroku's alone who had a glimpse of her, or at any rate seen a photograph. Is she pretty? Oyone had once asked. Better than average, I think, Koroku had answered. While waiting for the noodles to be prepared, the three of them addressed together the question of why the wedding was no longer take place before the new year. Oyone surmised that it had been called off on astrological grounds. Sosuke thought it was due to lack of time. Actually, I am pretty sure it's because of money, said Koroku, uncharacteristically the only one among them to voice a down-to-earth view. I mean, the other family is pretty extravagant, so our aunt can't get away from cutting lots of corners. That's the end of chapter 10. Uh, should I continue? This book is quite long. This is longer than I expected. It's like.
Stretch.
Where is this story going now? Saiki household slowly dwindling down into poverty after they cheated Sosuke family's money. That would be nice, but also sad because that means they just they they fucked up all the money that's supposed to be Sosuke's money. Really, assholes. Love it. I don't know, but it's difficult because Soseki he doesn't really write things like oh, this is a happy ending. If anything, he likes to write shit ending, not shit ending, like very sad ending. Not like I am a cat, Kokoro. It's like very bleak. The ending that he always writes, like it's not just the ending, like the kind of story that he writes is always very bleak. And definitely wondering what's gonna happen. I think might not read today, so I'm gonna read one more chapter and see how it goes. Let's read chapter 11. Chapter 11, The Gate by Natsume Soseki. It was in the late autumn when the crimson leaves had darkened and shriveled that Oyone began to show sign of ailing. Apart from the time in Kyoto, Oyone had seldom enjoyed extended periods of good health, whether in Hiroshima or Fukuoka, and in this respect, their move back to Tokyo had not brought about any great improvement. Sosuke had even begun to wonder if the very air here in the place she had been born and raised actually disagreed with her. Of late, however, her chronic affliction had noticeably abated. Episodes of the sort that caused Sosuke alarm that dwindled to a mere handful in any given year. Such sorry. Such such. Wait, hang on. The Kawasaki alarm had dwindled to a merely handful in any given year, such that both of them gained peace of mind in equal measure. He, in the course of his daily stint at the office, she in her routine at home in his absence, and so she had not concerned herself unduly when, towards the end of autumn, with the wind blowing over the frost and chilling her to her bone, she had begun to feel unwell. At first, Oyone said nothing to her husband, yet when he saw for himself that all was indeed not well with her, and urged her to see a doctor, she balked. Then the time had come for Koroku to move in. True state of Oyone's health in both mind and body was clearly visible to her husband, who was reluctant to upset the household by introducing a new member. But circumstances had tied their hands, and they were forced to carry on without further debate. Still, Sosuke mouthed word of advice about her getting plenty of rest, mindful though he was about his own inconsistency. Her smiling reply that she was perfectly all right did nothing to reassure him. Remarkably enough, Oyone experienced a heightened sense of well-being after Koroku moved in. It appeared that this minor increase in her responsibilities had a bracing effect on her. She applied herself with unexpected vigor to look after her husband and now his brother. If all this was lost on Koroku, Sosuke realized fully the extent of her extra efforts on their behalf. Even as he redoubled his appreciation for her diligence, he worried that the stress of their augmented household might deal a sudden serious blow to her frail health. Towards the end of the year, unfortunately, around the 20th of December, Sosuke's fears were in effect realized. Like tinder touched by a spark, he erupted in panic. The day had dawned heavily overcast. Not a single ray of sun struck the earth, with a heavy chill weighed down on people's heads. Having scarcely slept all the night before, Oyone began the day with a headache, but found, as she stoically went about her chores, that while certain motions triggered a degree of pain, these exertions, owing perhaps to the comparatively pleasant stimulation afforded by her surroundings, in fact made things more bearable than when she lay in bed with her mind focused on the pain alone. Up to the moment she saw Sosuke out the door, she also gained strength from the expectation that, as always, her condition would slip into a kind of equilibrium. But as but as soon as she but as soon as he had gone, and she permitted herself some momentary relief after having got through the first chores of the day, her head became increasingly oppressed by the leaden sky. Outside, everything looked frozen, and inside the house, the cold seemed to seep through the light stuffed shoji. Meanwhile, her head began to burn with an intense heat. She had no choice but to retrieve her futon from where it had been stored, spread it out again in the parlor, and lie down. This having brought no relief, she had Kiyo bring her damp towel that she draped over her head. The towel quickly turned lukewarm, so she had a basin of water placed near her pillow in which to immerse it from time to time. Oyone kept up this makeshift treatment until noontime. It brought her no relief at all, however, and she lacked the strength to join Koroku at lunch, asking Kiyo to set out the tray and serve Koroku his meals. She remained in her sickbed. She had Kiyo bring the puffy pillow that Sosuke normally used and exchange it for the stiff one on which her head had been resting up until now. Even the spirit of womanly concern about her hair coming undone had fairly deserted her. Koroku, emerging from the six-mat room, slid open the parlor door and peeked in on her for a moment, but finding her with her head turned towards the alcove, eyes shut, assuming, perhaps, that she was asleep, he closed the door without a word. With the ample sitting room table all to himself, he ignored proper etiquette and began to began his meal by pouring tea into his rice and audibly slurping it down. Yeah, ochazuke. Tastes great. Around 2 o'clock, Oyone finally dozed off for a while. When she woke up, the damp towel that she had draped over her forehead was now warm and nearly dry, but at least her head had receded some. Now, however, she was assailed by a different, crushing form of pain that spread from her shoulder down her spine. Telling herself it would make things far worse not to take some nourishment, she struggled on her feet and nibbled on a late lunch. Kiyo fussed over Oyone as she served her meal, repeatedly asking how she felt. She appeared, in fact, to be in a good deal better, but after having the futon removed and sat down by the brazier to wait for her husband's return, Sosuke came home at the usual hour. She described for Oyone the sight he had seen in the streets of Kanda, the banners displayed at all the shops where the year-end sales were in full swing, the white and crimson curtain that had been hung up in the bazaar provided the band that played there with a splendid backdrop. He ended by urging her, "It's very lively. You should go and see for yourself. It's easy to get there by streetcar." These utterances issued from a face so ruddy it appears as though corroded by the cold. With Sosuke offering Oyone such thoughtful suggestions, sarcasm, it it was all but unthinkable for her to rebuff him with protestations of poor health. At the moment she did not, in fact, feel very sick. As darkness fell, she helped her husband change, folding his office clothes and the like with her usual placidity. At around 9 o'clock, however, returned. Oyone suddenly turned to Sosuke and said that she would retire early as she was feeling under the weather, since she had been chatting with him until then in her normal, affable fashion. Sosuke was somewhat taken aback by this announcement, reassured by her insistence that it was nothing serious. However, he finally sent her off to bed. He spent the next 20 minutes looking about the room in the quiet of evening, bathed in a soft lamplight, whilst listening to the gurgle of the iron kettle. He called to mind the reports of general salary increase for government workers slated for the coming year. His thoughts then turned to rumors of the administrative reform and staffing retrenchment that would ineluctably precede the pay raise. He wondered with some apprehension which category he would fall into in such a process. He regretted that Sugihara, who arranged his transfer to Tokyo, was no longer a section chief in his department. Where attendance was concerned, Sosuke had not been ill even once, remarkably, since the move, and he had not taken a single sick day. It was true, though, that after dropping out of Kyoto University, he had scarcely read a book, and he was less learned than the average person in his position. Still, his intelligence was not so limited as to impede him from carrying out his duties in the bureaucracy. Having mulled over an array of factors, Sosuke concluded that things would turn out satisfactorily for him in the end. He gently flicked a fingernail against the rim of the iron kettle. Can I say stop getting curdle? Iron kettle. Just then, Oyone called out to him in distress. Without thinking, he leaped to his feet and rushed to the parlor. There he found Oyone half out in the covers, her upper torso completely off the futon, her brows furrowed, and she was gripping her shoulders tightly from her right hand. Sosuke unconsciously reached out and placed his hand on hers. He then pressed where she pressed, right on the shoulder blade. "A little farther over," Oyone implored. It took several more tries before his hand found the right spot, just below the base of her neck and close to the ridge of her spine. Pressing down with his fingers, he felt a stone-like nodule. He begged him to bear down the spot with all his might. Sosuke pressed down so hard that his forehead broke out in sweat. But even this exertion was not enough to give his wife relief. Sosuke was aware of the condition, but condition known by the old-fashioned terms curious shoulders. Shoulders. When he was just a child, his grandfather had told him of a story of a samurai who, suddenly stricken with a shoulder spasm during a mission and had leapt down from his horse, drew his sword and immediately cut into the top of his shoulder, letting blood gush out and thus managing to save his life. Now the memory of this story came flooding back. Sosuke was of no mind to perform remedy presented in this anecdote. Still, he couldn't help wondering whether or not cutting into the shoulder with a sharp blade would have the desired effect. Oyone's face was uncharacteristically flushed, even her ears were tinged with red. When Sosuke asked if she felt hot, he replied with difficulty that she did. He called out loudly to Kiyo, directing her to fill an ice bag with cold water and bring it to him at once. Unfortunately, it seemed that they had no ice bag. Kiyo produced instead, as she had earlier in the day, a hand towel immersed in basin water. While she applied the damp towel onto Oyone's forehead, Sosuke immediately resumed his effort to bear down as hard as possible on the back of her shoulder. He asked her repeatedly if she felt any relief, but all she could murmur faintly that it still hurts. Sosuke was at his wits' end, on the verge of rushing out of the house in search of a doctor. He realized that he could not possibly set foot out of the door of what might happen in his absence. "Listen, Kiyo," he said. "Go out to the main road right away, buy an ice bag, and then find a doctor. It's early though. You'll be able to find someone." "It's 9:15, said Kiyo, who had hurried over the clock in the sitting room. She proceeded from there to the kitchen door and rummaging around for her clocks. Fortuitously, Koroku returned to the house. As he made his way towards his room without announcing himself to his brother, Sosuke called out to him in a sharp tone that stopped him in his track. Koroku hesitated for a moment in the sitting room, but after hearing his name called twice in a more rapid succession, he was compelled to mutter a reply and poke his head into the parlor. His eyes were bloodshot, the lingering effect of a drink. Only after a closer look around the room did he register astonishment. Has something happened to Nesang?" he said. All traces of inebriation had left his face. Sosuke repeated to Koroku the instruction that he had given to Kiyo and asked him to hurry. Koroku headed straight back to the vestibule, never having the chance to remove his cloak. "Even if I hurry, it will take time to find a doctor," he said. "Why don't I borrow the Sakai's telephone and call for one right away?" "Yes, please do," said Sosuke. While waiting for Koroku to return from his errand, he had Kiyo constantly replenish the water in the basin as he alternated between applying pressure to the affected area and massage. He could not bear to sit idly by and watch Oyone suffer. That the ministrations brought him at least some relief. Still, there was nothing more trying for Sosuke than to wait for the doctor to arrive. In the minutes ticked away. Even as he rubbed Oyone's shoulder, he strained to hear the faintest sound that might echo from down the street. By the time the doctor finally arrived, Sosuke felt for a brief moment as though the long night had come to an end. For his part, the doctor observed the normal professional decorum and showed no sign of alarm. He performed his examination with aplomb, his briefcase still tucked under his arm, as though this were a short routine visit to a patient of long standing. The thoroughly unruffled look on the doctor's face was duly noted by Sosuke, and his racing pulse at last slowed down. The doctor recommended 3 immediate, if temporary, treatments, applying mustard plasters on the affected area, warming the patient's feet with hot compresses, and cooling her forehead with an ice bag. He himself then prepared a mustard plaster, spreading it over Oyone's shoulder, and looked around the base of her neck. Kiyo and Koroku took charge of the hot compresses, while Sosuke applied the ice bag wrapped in his hand towel to her forehead. These ministrations continued for about an hour, saying that he would stay and observe their effects on the patient. The doctor remained seated at her bedside. He and Sosuke exchanged some small talk from time to time, but for the most part they silently regarded the state of their patient. Outside, night wore on amidst the customary stillness. My, but it's getting cold, said the doctor. Feeling sorry for the man, Sosuke urged that he convey instructions for Oyone's further care and then linger no longer. For compared to how she had been earlier, Oyone seemed almost in high spirit now. I think you're out of the woods now, the doctor said to her. I'm going to prescribe a single dose of medicine for you that I want you to take tonight. Please, I think you'll be able to sleep then. When the doctor left, Koroku followed him out in order to fetch the medicine. During Koroku's absence, Oyone gazed up to Sosuke's face near her pillow and asked the time. In contrast to earlier that evening, the blood had now left her cheeks, and the side of her face where the lamplight fell looked especially pale. Sosuke thought her pallor might be exaggerated by her black hair. Pallor, which might be exaggerated by her black hair, which was thoroughly disheveled, and he carefully brushed the locks away from her cheeks. You seem a little bit better, he said. Yes, I'm really quite comfortable now, she replied, displaying one of her characteristic smiles. Even when in distress, Oyone generally did not neglect to smile for Sosuke. From the sitting room, to which Kiyo had withdrawn and simply flopped down, came the sound of snoring. Oyone asked Sosuke to send her to bed. By the time Koroku returned with the medicine, Oyone ingested it as prescribed. It was close to midnight. Within 20 minutes, the patient was sound asleep. What a relief, said Sosuke, looking at Oyone's face. After studying his sister-in-law's appearance for a while, Koroku responded, You'll be all right. Together, they eased the ice pack away from her forehead. Shortly after, Koroku went to his room. Sosuke spread out his futon next to Oyone and slept his usual sleep. 5 or 6 hours later, leaving behind a sharp needless of frost, the winter night gave way to a cloudless dawn. Over the next hour, splashing light across the land, the sun rose boldly, unchallenged into a blue sky. Oyone remained fast asleep. Sosuke finished breakfast, and as the time for him to leave for the office approached, Oyone still showed no sign of waking up from her slumber. Bending down over her pillow, he listened to her sleep. He listened to her deep breathing and wondered whether he should go to work or take the day off. Whew. That was the end of chapter 11. Pretty intense. The way it was written, the way it was described, the whole thing, it's very scary. Like it's like you're there. Why? This is why I like Natsume Soseki. A government worker who has never taken a day off. That just sounds like a Japanese, any Japanese. But his wife is sick now. So what do you think he would do? Do you think he will take a day off, take care of her, or do you think that he will still go to work? Dun, 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 dun. Any answer? Oh no. But he give me an answer. Yeah, I do not think there's a raid going on. My poor static. Okay. If there's no raid, I'm gonna continue. Like this house, I decorate. Like this basement, I decorate it. I made this like this. And Right. Yeah, let me drink my tea. That will control. How many chapters? Oh wow, this is chapter 20 until chapter 23. I think if I read until, but they are like very very short chapters. I can read 12. Fine. Okay. We're now reading chapter 12 of The Gate by Natsume Soseki. That morning at the office, Sosuke commenced the day's task as his usual fashion. By his natural concern for the ailing Oyone, exacerbated by the vivid recollections of scenes from the previous night by her sickbed that kept flashing before his mind's eyes, prevented any satisfactory performance. He made one bungling effort after another, then, having waited until noon, he resolved to leave the office. On the streetcar, he conjured up for himself a certain encouraging development. Oyone waking up at some point, feeling much better and no longer in danger of another attack. There were very few fellow passengers at this hour, in contrast to his regular commute. He was scarcely distracted by the external stimuli that could therefore shift his gaze inward onto images that were spontaneously projected inside his mind. Meanwhile, the streetcar had reached the last stop. When he came to the front gate, not a sound was to be heard from inside the house, which seems deserted. He slid open the latticework door, removed his shoes, and stepped across the threshold. Still, no one emerged to greet him. Instead of following the veranda around the sitting room as he usually did, he went through the vestibule and entered the parlor where Oyone would be resting. And there she was, still fast asleep. All was the same as it had been that morning. The red lacquer tray by her pillow with the empty medicine packet, the glass, and even the water that had been left in it. She lay facing the alcove as she had when he left, with her left cheek visible and mustard plaster showing on the collar line. Even Oyone's slumber was unchanged from what he had observed in the morning, so deep that only her breathing evinced some connection with this world. Indeed, not a single detail of his wife's appearance had been altered from what had been registered in his brain on his departure. Well, without removing his overcoat, Sosuke bent down and listened a while to the rhythm of her breathing. It did not seem as though she could be easily awakened. He counted on his fingers the hours that he had been sleeping since taking the medicine the night before. For the first time, his face betrayed his anxiety. Sosuke worried that when Oyone was unable to sleep the previous evening, but as he studied her now, he wondered if this being lost to the world for so long was not still more alarming. He placed his hand on Oyone's coverlet and shook her gently. Her hair billowed out over the pillow, but the rhythm of her slumberous breathing remained unchanged. Leaving his wife be, Sosuke passed into the sitting room, and from there into the kitchen. In the sink, teacups and lacquer bowls were soaking in a basin, and still unwashed. She peeked to a kiosk room and found her stretched out in the floor, a small tray of food beside her, her head inclined towards the rice tub. He then slid the door open to the six-mat room and stuck his head in. Koroku was asleep, with covers pulled up over his head. Sosuke had changed his clothes and by himself folded the articles he had shed, put them away in the closet. He then proceeded to light the charcoal brazier and put the kettle on. Leaning on the brazier, he pondered for a few minutes, then stood up and set about waking Koroku first, Kiyo next, in both cases they leaped into their feet with a start. When Sosuke asked his brother how Oyone had fared so far today, Koroku said actually he had felt so sleepy that he nodded off after eating lunch around 11:30. But up until then, Oyone had been sleeping peacefully. I want you to go to the doctor's, Sosuke said. Tell him that ever since taking that medicine last night, she hasn't opened her eyes once, and ask him if this is normal. With a murmur of acknowledgement, Koroku bolted from the house. Sosuke returned to the parlor and gazed intently at Oyone's face. Arms folded, he agonized over whether to risk the possible ill effects of not rousing her immediately, or to incur whatever harm might come from waking her up out of this deep sleep. He could not decide. Presently, Koroku returned and reported that when he explained the things to the doctor, who had been about to leave on his daily rounds, he said he would come by as soon as he'd seen a couple of other patients. But in the meantime, Sosuke rejoined, was it all right simply to leave her in her present state? Koroku only said that the doctor told him nothing beyond what he has just reported. This put Sosuke right back where he has been before, seated rigidly at Oyone's bedside. Both the doctor and Koroku, he felt, were lacking in concern. Recalling Koroku's flushed face upon his return to the house the previous night while he was in the midst of caring for his ailing wife, Sosuke's annoyance redoubled. He had not been aware of Koroku's drinking until Oyone first brought it to his attention, yet, when observing his brother closely after that, he had come to the conclusion that Koroku indeed lacked a certain moral fiber, and that the situation warranted a serious talk in due time. Even so, Sosuke shrank from the prospect of exposing Oyone to sour looks on the faces of those around her, and had not yet broached the topics. But then he asked himself, why not come out with it now when Oyone is fast asleep? Even if our tempers ran with us, it wouldn't upset her now. And yet, one look at his wife's utterly insensible face was enough to dislodge this train of thought and renew his anxiety. He felt impelled to wake her up this instant. Sorry. Still, he hesitated. At that moment, he was delivered from this agitation by the arrival of the doctor. Briefcase tucked primly under his arm, as on the previous visit, the doctor nodded and puffed leisurely on his cigarette as he heard Sosuke out. Well then, if you excuse me, I'll examine the patient, he said, turning towards Oyone. As though conducting a routine checkup, he spent some time taking her pulse, his gaze fixed firmly on his watch. He then placed a black stethoscope over her heart, studiously edging it this way and that way over her skin. Finally, he produced a reflector with a small round hole in the middle and asked Sosuke to light the candle. Not having a candle, he had Kiyo light an oil lamp. The doctor raised one of Oyone's closed eyelids and directed the ray of sunlight from the reflector past the lashes into the recesses of her eyes. The examination over, doctor turned to Sosuke. Seeing that the medicine worked a bit too well. Seeing the look in Sosuke's eyes, he hastened to explain. But there is certainly no cause for alarm. In cases like this, any serious reaction would affect the heart or the brain, and on the basis of my examination, I find nothing unusual in either department. At this, Sosuke at last felt reassured. As the doctor was preparing to leave, he explained that this medicine was fairly new. In theory, it had fewer adverse effects than other soporifics, but its effects varied greatly according to the constitution of the individual patient. Detaining him for a moment longer, Sosuke asked, "There's no harm, then, in just letting her sleep on like this?" So long as none of them had any pressing obligations, he replied. There was no need to wake her. After the doctor's departure, Sosuke suddenly felt very hungry. The iron kettle he had put on in the sitting room was whistling away. He summoned Kiyo and told her to serve dinner. Flustered, she responded that she hasn't even begun preparations. Indeed, it was still some time before dinner hour. Sosuke sat comfortably by the brazier, legs crossed, and made do for the time being while downing 4 bowls of rice gruel in rapid succession, munching on pickled radishes in between. About 30 minutes later, Oyone's eyes opened of their own accord. Oh, that was a bit intense and scary, the way it was described. It could be in a coma, you know? Well, I guess I'm not gonna rate today, so I'm gonna just continue reading as much as I can. There it is. That was the end of chapter 12. We shall continue in chapter 13. Chapter 13 of The Gate by Natsume Soseki. Having decided to have his hair cut for the new year, Sosuke stepped into a barber shop for the first time in a long while. With the holiday fast approaching, the shop was quite crowded, and scissors snipped in unison at several different chairs, offering a fittingly busy accompaniment to a spectacle he had just witnessed among the crowds in the streets. Everyone seemingly in rush to leap out of this frigid season into spring. As he sat by the heating stove, smoking a cigarette and waiting for his turn, Sosuke felt himself ineluctably swept forward by a force beyond his control and along the faceless tide of humanity being propelled toward the mirror. Although, in fact, he had no fresh expectations for the new year that lays ahead, he was unwittingly goaded by the surrounding populace into a certain excitement. With time, the symptoms accompanying Oyone's attack thoroughly abated. Her recovery had by now reached the point where Sosuke was able to resume his normal routine and not worry much about being out of the house. While the couple's customary New Year's celebrations were quiet and low-key, the preparations for this season still made it the busiest time of the year for Oyone. Sosuke had been resigned to this New Year's being even more subdued than usual. Just seeing Oyone before him, however, looking as if she had been given a new life, filled him with relief. He felt as though a tragic drama had receded into the background, and yet there had drifted across his mind, like a dark mist, a vague premonition that his drama would someday assume another form and engulf his family. Watching the people all around him intent on making the short winter days even busier with their frantic activity, as if driven by the ebbing year to fill every moment. Sosuke felt all the more weighed down by this nameless dread of this thing to come. It even popped into his head that, were it possible, he would choose to linger amid the shadows of the nearly spent year. His turn at the chair having come at last, caught sight of his reflection in the cold mirror, whereupon he asked himself, "Who is this person staring out at me?" He was draped in white sheets from neck down, and he could not make out the color or pattern of his suit. It was then that he noticed in the background of the reflection a wicker cage that housed the barber's pet bird. The tiny bird hopped lightly on its perch. When Sosuke emerged onto the street, his head fragrantly anointed and his ears ringing with the barber's hearty farewell, he felt utterly refreshed. Feeling the cold air against his skin, he had to admit that, as Oyone had claimed, a haircut can go a long way toward improving one's mood. Question came about. A question having came about their water bill. Sosuke stopped off at the Sakai's on his way home. Ushered inside by a maid, he assumed he would be conducted to the usual place, but the maid swiftly led him through the parlor towards the sitting room. The sliding door was partly open, leaving a 2-foot gap through the surrounded several voices raised in laughter. The Sakai household was as usual in high spirits. The master of the house was seated facing him on the far side of the long, low brazier of highly polished wood. His wife sat slightly off to one side towards the shoji that opened onto the veranda, her gaze likewise fixed on him. Behind Sakai stood a tall, slender pendulum clock encased in a black frame. To the right of the clock was a plain wall, to the left a recessed cupboard in which hung an assortment of these decorative objects, such as rubbings, illustrated haikus, and painted fans with the ribs removed. Along with Mr. and Mrs. Sakai, two of the daughters were wearing matching patterns jacket with tight sleeves and round collars set shoulder to shoulder. The older one looked to be about 12 years old, the younger about 10. The two pairs of eyes sat The two pairs of eyes opened wide at the sight of Sosuke emerging from the other side of the door, with traces of the just now subsiding merriment evident at the corners of the eyes and mouth. Sosuke then discovered, in addition to the parents and daughters, the odd figure of a man crouched down deferentially near the threshold. Sosuke deduced within the first few minutes of sitting down that the outburst of laughter he had heard earlier must have erupted in the course of the family's conversation with this strange man. His reddish hair looked as gritty as sand. His face was sunburned to a hue likely to last a lifetime. He wore a white cotton shirt fastened with ceramic buttons, dangling from a cord visible from the collar of his coarse, homespun padded jacket. There was an old-fashioned traveler's purse. Sorry. Purse. His appearance proclaimed him as an inhabitant of some remote mountainous locale from which he could only infrequently descend to Tokyo. In an added touch, despite the cold weather, his attire managed to leave his kneecaps exposed. Every so often, he would extract a towel from the back of his faded blue sash and wipe his nose with it. This man has come to Tokyo all the way from the province of Kai, with bolts of cloths strapped on his back, said Sakai by the way of an introduction, whereupon the man turned to Sosuke. Yes, sir. Please, won't you buy something? Thus prompted. Sosuke noticed that the fabric samples had been spread out all over the room. Mason, crepe de chine, white pongee, and the like. He marveled at the congruity between, on the hand, the man's ludicrous attire and style of speech, and on the other, the exquisite goods he has come bearing on his back. Mrs. Sakai related for his benefit how this peddler's village was nothing but a mass volcanic rock, where no rice or even millet would grow, so that people had no choice but to plant mulberry bushes and raise silkworms. Even so, the place was dirt poor, it seemed. Only a single family possessed a pendulum clock, and no more than 2 or 3 children went to school beyond elementary grades. I gather that our visitor here is the only person in the village who can write, she concluded with a laugh. You are dead right about that, Peddler chimed in, as if his confirmation had been sought. Whether it's reading or writing, arithmetic or penmanship, there's nobody up there but me who can handle these things. You wouldn't believe that place. Spreading out one fabric sample after another for the Sakai's inspection, the man said repeatedly,
Please, won't you buy this? When they told him the price was too high, he better cut it down, and so far he would respond with, Why, that ain't hardly nothing. On my knees, I'm begging you, take it for this much. Now go on, just feel the weight of it. And other such backwood phrases, each of them greeted by his audience with loud laughter. The master and mistress of the house, apparently at leisure today, kept egging the man on. But tell us now, inquired Mrs. Sakai, when you're on the road, toting your goods and all, do you manage to eat properly? I couldn't hardly go without eating, could I? I mean, if I get hungry, well. And what sort of place do you eat at? What sort of place? Why, I chow down at the tea houses. Laughing, Sakai asked him what he meant by tea house, to which he replied, a place where they feed you. The man then amused them by recalling how when he first came to Tokyo, the food was so good that he settled down to serious eating. His 3 meals a day proved too much for most inns to handle. He had to feel sorry for them himself. In the end, the dry goods peddler succeeded in selling Mrs. Sakai one roll of pongee made of twisted silk and another roll of white silk gauze. Witnessing this purchase of a summer fabric in the dead winter, Sosuke was again struck by the distinctive habits of the well-to-do. Sakai then turned to Sosuke. And what about something for your wife? Say some cloth for an everyday kimono? Mrs. Sakai added here and there that there was also a good deal to be saved, such and such a percent by buying a fabric this way. She then assured him that if you would take care of any payment right now, he could reimburse them whenever it was convenient. Finally, Sosuke decided to buy a single roll of mason for Oyone. Sakai proceeded and mercilessly beat down the price to 3 yen. That ain't hardly nothing at all, the man said, defeated. It's enough to make me cry. Everyone burst out laughing. Evidently, the dry goods peddler managed to do business with any number of customers despite his backwoods speech. As he made the rounds of his regulars all over the cities, the load on his back steadily decreased until in the end there remained only some wrapping cloth and slender sanada sashes. By the time he got to this point, he explained, it was always around old Lunar New Year he would return to his province for a spell and greet the spring there. Then, when the new bolts of cloth strapped to his back, he was off to the city again. This fresh stock would be converted into cash by the end of April and beginning of May, which coincided with the busy season for growing silkworm, when he would again returned to his small village and a pile of volcanic rocks below the north face of Mount Fuji. In the 4 or 5 years he has been coming to us, he hasn't changed a bit, Mrs. Sakai commented. Yes, a remarkable fellow, her husband observed. In these times, when after a few days at home went out to find that the streets had been widened, or if one skipped the newspaper for a single day, missed learning about the new streetcar line, or someone who had been coming to Tokyo twice a year to have kept thoroughly intact his mountain man ways, it was truly remarkable. After observing the face of this dry goods peddler, along with his attire, his language, and his way of interacting with people, Sosuke came to feel a kind of sympathy for him. On his way home from the Sakai's, Sosuke switching the bundle of just purchased mason back and forth from one flap to the cape to the other, vividly retained in his mind the eye of the image of the man who had just sold him this fine cloth for a paltry 3 yen. The stripes of his coarse homespun jacket, his desiccated ruddy hair, which, stiff and lackluster as it was, he somehow managed to keep immaculately parted down the middle.
At home, Oyone had just finished sewing for Sosuke a new kimono jacket marking the new year. The lack of proper press, she had placed it under a cushion and was sitting on it. Spread it out on your futon tonight and sleep on it, she said, casting a glance over her shoulder at her husband. On hearing his account of the man from Kai who had been at the Sakai's, Oyone could not help laughing out loud herself. And so cheap, she said over and over as she feasted her eyes on the texture and stripe pattern of the mason that he had brought her. The material was indeed of the highest quality. How can he possibly make a profit at such prices? She asked at length. The reason is that the middleman was making far too much profit, answered Sosuke, who, extrapolating from this single bolt of mason, answered as if he were an expert in the trade. Conversation then shifted into the comfortable circumstances enjoyed by the Sakais if their wealth sometimes made them prey to swindles like the likes of the furniture dealer. It also gave them the advantage of stocking up cheaply articles for which they had no pressing needs. And from this point of departure on the general subject of the astonishingly bright, lively lives they led, of course, it's not just that they have money, Sosuke said to Oyone, his tone suddenly altered. It also has to do with all those children they have. As long as they are children, even poor families can be very cheerful. In Oyone's ears, his tone resounded with a harsh self-reproach over their lonely existence. Involuntarily taking her hands off the bolt of the cloth in her lap, she glanced at her husband's face, so full of satisfaction at having brought some rare joy into his wife's life in the form of this pleasing gift acquired through the Sakais. Sosuke was unaware of how his words sounded to her. Oyone let the matter pass, only her brief glance but decided to broach it at bedtime. Not long after they had gone to bed at their usual time of a little past 10, Oyone turned to her husband before he could doze off and said, "Earlier tonight, you said not having children makes life dreary, didn't you?" Sosuke recalled that he had said something very general along those lines, but he certainly not intended it as a pointed reference to Oyone herself. Reeled in this fashion, he was totally at loss for a reply. "Oh, I wasn't talking about us," he said. Oyone listened in silence. Then, after a pause, she said, "But you're always thinking how dreary things are at home, so you must have meant what you said, did you not?" She was essentially repeating the same point she had made before. Inwardly, Sosuke had to agree with her interpretation, but in the interest of sparing her feelings, she could not bring himself to make such a blunt admission. To soothe his still convalescent wife, it would be best, he thought, to treat the matter as nothing but a joke. He shifted to the lightest tone he could manage. "Well," he began, "I said dreary, and naturally things do get dreary at times, but..." Here he came out against the wall, unable to think of anything novel or amusing. In the end, he was reduced to saying, "Oh, never mind it, don't worry about it." These two having met with silence from Oyone, he decided to change the subject. "I hear there was another fire last night," Sosuke said, venturing into current events. "I'm very sorry for what this has done to you." Oyone suddenly broke out in a painful, heartfelt apology, then faltered and fell silent. With her back to the lamp, which was set as usual as in the alcove, he could not make out her expression, but he could hear the quavering in her voice. Sosuke, who had been lying in his bag and staring at the ceiling, turned to his wife, gazed intently at her through the very dim light. She peered back at him. "For a long time I've been wanting to say how sorry I am. from the bottom of my heart, she said haltingly. But it's been hard for me to put into words, and so I just let it go up to now.
Sosuke knew.
What to make of this? He wondered if it might be a touch of hysteria, but he could not be sure. He said nothing. He was in a daze.
Oyone spoke again in anguish, and this time in finality. I can never have a child.
Then she burst into tears. At a loss at how to console his wife after she had made such a heart-rending confession, Sosuke found his pity for her mounting ever higher.
Oh well, children, they're not worth all the trouble, are they? I mean, just look at the brood that the Sakais have. You can't help but feel sorry for them. It was like a nursery up there. But but to know that there will be never a single one, say what you will, that can't make you happy. Who is to say that you couldn't have one still? You might. Who knows?
At this, Oyone only cried harder. Helpless, Sosuke could only wait stoically until she regained some composure. Then he listened as she unburdened herself. Although, in the course of their life together, the two of them had achieved greater harmony than the average couple. Where children were concerned, they had been less fortunate than most. Had it been a clear-cut case of infertility, it would have been easier to bear, but to lose the children they had actually conceived, this had made their misfortune all the more keenly felt. Oyone's first pregnancy had occurred shortly after they left Kyoto, while they were just scraping by in Hiroshima in their Hiroshima lodgings. Once she had realized her condition, Oyone went from day-to-day lunching between two simultaneous dreams of the future, one terrifying, the other euphoric. Sosuke privately viewed the new development as an outward manifestation of the intangible spirit of love that they shared, and was filled with joy. As they waited, they took pleasure in counting his fingers the months and the weeks remaining until the lump of flesh to which he had contributed a part of himself would come to term and appear dancing before their eyes. But the couple's hopes were dashed when the fetus was cast out from the womb at only 5 months. This was the period when they were only barely getting by. In the most straight end circumstances, gazing at Oyone's ashen face after the miscarriage, Sosuke was convinced that this, too, was a result of their poverty. He lamented that such fruits of their love could be crushed by sheer material wants and had now been placed out of their reach indefinitely. For her part, Oyone simply wept. It was not long after they moved to Fukuoka, however, that once again she found herself craving for sour foods. Having heard tales of how one miscarriage tends to lead to another, Oyone became cautious about the smallest thing and conducted herself with the utmost restraint. Perhaps this had an effect, for the pregnancy proceeded in the virtually textbook fashion until inexplicably she gave birth prematurely. The midwife, shaking her head, urged Oyone to have the doctor seen by a doctor. The baby have the baby be seen by a doctor. After an examination, the doctor told them that since the infant was not fully developed, their room must be kept in precise elevated temperature without any fluctuations between day and night, something that would of course require some generating extra heat. In their current circumstances, all Sosuke could do was provide space heating stove. The couple devoted all their time and meager resources in an intense effort to save the child's life, but it all came to a naught. After 1 week of this small creature, who shed their blood and bore witness of their love for each other, turned cold and lifeless. "Whatever shall we do?" Oyone sobbed, cradling the baby's body in her arms. Sosuke received this new blow with a manly stoicism. As the baby's cold flesh was reduced to ashes and the ashes put to rest in the dark earth. He did not utter one word of protest. With the passage of time, the shadowy gap that had opened up between them narrowed and vanished together. There had been the third episode that formed yet another painful memory. Within a year after their return to Tokyo, Oyone became pregnant again. Her health after the move being far from robust, Sosuke, not to mention Oyone, was extremely concerned. Yet, they summoned their hopes. This time for sure, they both thought, and were increasingly buoyed with each uneventful month that passed by. But then, at the fifth month, Oyone committed a surprising blunder. Since the municipal water supply had not been put through to their district, the maid constantly had to scurry back and forth to draw water at the well where she did the laundry. One day, needing to speak while the maid was with the maid while the latter was still at the well, Oyone went out herself and while talking, stepped over a basin near the faucet, whereupon she slipped and fell on the mossy wet planks there, landing on her buttocks. Fearing that she had ruined things again, she was too ashamed of her carelessness to tell Sosuke about the mishap and maintain a rigorous silence. The days passed, however, without any ill effect on the quickening fetus or any palpable injury to herself. Only then she did finally, with much relief, make a clean breast of the matter to her husband long after the fact. Not disposed from the start to reproach his wife, Sosuke let the incident pass with only a mild admonition. You must avoid doing anything risky or you'll run into trouble, he said. In due course, then the pregnancy approached full term. Oyone had now reached the stage where the baby would come any day, and Sosuke could think of nothing but his wife, even while at the office. On his way home, he would dwell incessantly on whether or not she had given birth during his absence, and pause outside the lattice-work door into his own house in anticipation. On a couple of occasions, on not hearing the half-expected newborn cries, he leapt to conclusion that something had gone awry and charged headlong into the house, only to feel mortified at the awkward figure he must have cut. Fortunately, Oyone went into labor one evening, a time when Sosuke, being at home and having no other business, could stay by her side. In this respect, at least, it was propitious beginning. The midwife was sent for without any great haste. Gaze and gauze and such were laid out at the ready. The delivery itself took place with unexpected ease. Sadly, however, the infant emerged from the confines of the womb to the world without taking much of a single breath of air. Wielding a tubular glass instrument, the midwife repeatedly forced her own breath into the tiny mouth, but to no avail. What had come to this world was an inert lump of flesh, clearly etched, as they could see, with a pair of eyes, a nose, and a mouth. But from its throat there issued nary a cry for them to hear. The midwife had paid Oyone a house call just a week earlier to examine the fetus, even auscultating its heart, pronounced it to be in excellent condition. Even supposing for the moment that the midwife examinations were faulty, if fetal development had in fact ceased at point prior to the delivery, surely Oyone would have suffered ill effects, unless, of course, the fetus was aborted. Sosuke's subsequent wider search for an explanation yielded a startling and horrifying discovery that the fetus must have been perfectly normal up to the final moments of the delivery, only to be strangled by the prolapsed umbilical cord that had wrapped around its neck. In the event of this abnormal occurrence, the only possible remedy lies in the hands of a skilled midwife, who then, detecting the obstruction as she reaches in, will untangle the cord and put it out of the way. This much the midwife whom Sosuke had engaged, being well on in years, clearly understood. In this case, however, as sometimes happens, the prolapsed cord had ringed the tiny cord not once but twice. As the midwife probed the constricted area with her fingers, she missed one coil and pressed hard against the infant's windpipe until it choked to death. The midwife was partly at fault, to be sure, but the greater blame lay with Oyone's mishap. When in her fifth month, she fell over backwards and landed hard on the ground beside the well. She had curated the condition for the prolapsed umbilical cord. When Oyone listened to this explanation as she lay on the sickbed, she nodded feebly and said nothing. Her eyes, noticeably sunken from fatigue, misted over behind her long, constantly fluttering lashes. Murmuring consolations, Sosuke wiped the tears from her cheeks with his handkerchief. Such was the couple's history where children of their own were concerned. Having suffered the loss, anguish of losing a child 3 times over, they were not disposed to speak about children much at all. Nevertheless, however unspoken, these memories suffused the most private part of their life together with a sadness that showed no sign of dissipating. At times, even in the midst of laughing together over some little thing, they would both experience intimations of these shadows of their past. Even at the moment of her outburst then, Oyone had no intention of going over with Sosuke again the details of this shared experience. Nor could they have seen any reason there and listened had his wife simply dredged up those same sad, familiar events. They need to go to therapy. That's all I can say. They need therapy. They need couples therapy. I know a place that's very good for couples therapy. Is it too late now? Is it too late now? Is it 100 years too late? Sorry, it's very sad. What Oyone had now begun to unburden herself about had nothing to do with the facts of their common past. Learning from her husband of the chain of circumstances that had led to the loss of their third child, she had come to see herself as a mother of monstrous cruelty. Although she had not committed the deed with her own hands, she concluded that she might as well have laid in wait on the shadowy path connecting the darkness with the light in order to wring the breath from the very one to whom she herself had given life. Having reached this conclusion, Oyone could not help viewing herself as a criminal, guilty of the most horrendous acts. Thereafter, unbeknownst to anyone, she had been subjected to hitherto unimagined torments of conscience, and there was not a soul in all the world with whom she could suffer some portion of these torments. She did not divulge her feelings even to her husband. He needs therapy. Ah, it's therapy. I need to talk to someone about her guilt and stuff. And after this last episode, Oyone went through the same 3 weeks bed rest she would have gone after a normal childbirth. Physically, this interval brought her much needed repose. Emotionally, however, the 3 weeks became a daunting test of her endurance. Sosuke made a small coffin for the infant's body and conducted a funeral unwitnessed by anyone. After that, he made a small wooden tablet inscribed in black lacquer with the posthumous bestowed Buddhist name of the deceased. Although the infant thus commemorated bore a sanctified name, what this small soul might have been called in everyday life, neither parent could say. At first, Sosuke kept the tablet on top of the chest of drawers in the sitting room, where in the evening, on returning from the office, he would, without fail, burn incense before it. Scent occasionally reached Oyone's nostrils. Confined to the six-mat room, she was lying in at some remove, yet her senses were keen enough for it to register. After a period of time, something prompting him to take down the small tablet and place it at the bottom drawer of the chest. In this same drawer were carefully stored, wrapped separately in cotton cloth, the memorial tablets of the child who had died in Fukuoka and Sosuke's father who had ended his days in Tokyo. When the Tokyo home had been disposed of, Sosuke had not wanted to be burdened with an ancestral tablet. As he wandered about the country, he deposited all of them at the family temple and took with him only the newly made tablets of his late father. While confined to her bed, Oyone's eyes and ears kept her acutely aware of each and every step Sosuke took in the house. Lying face up in her futon, in her mind's eye, she tied together the miniature tablets of her two dead offsprings in the long invisible thread of her own sad destiny. Following the thread still farther, she saw it dangling down on like a wraith-like shadow, the aborted fetus which never assumed a human form, and which no tablet has been made. Each and every one of the recollected episodes in Hiroshima, Fukuoka, and Tokyo was bound by the same immutable fate, whose solemn reign she felt compelled to acknowledge. Once she had done so, and once she had realized that she had been molded by this fate into a mother who, over the months and years, was mysteriously doomed to relieve the same misfortune again and again. She detected, to her dismay, a curse being whispered in her ear. Even as her body, lying there in the futon, eagerly submitted to the biological imperative of 3 weeks rest, she was conscious every move of this whispered curse reverberating on her eardrums. And so it was this 3 week period of repose, in fact, turned into protracted, excruciating test of Oyone's spirit. After passing the first 2 weeks of this confinement with her gaze fixed inward, she reached to the point where just lying there stoically became impossible. The day after the visiting nurse departed, Oyone stole out of the bed and walked around a little bit, but she was not easily distracted from the anxiety that continually gnawed at her. However much she forced her body to move about, her mind refused to budge. Discouraged yet again, she burrowed back under the covers so recently cast aside. At times, she shut her eyes very tight, as if to keep the human world at bay. Oyone completed the full 3 weeks of bed rest. When the time was up, her body naturally felt reinvigorated, but after removing all traces of her sickbed, she peered into the mirror and detected signs of renewed life about the eyebrows. This was the season for traditional changing of clothes. Even the forlorn Oyone was by no means sensible to the Japanese pre- predilection for marking the shift from spring to summer with bold, bright adornments, but the momentary stimulation it afforded only served to stir things up deep inside her until they floated to the surface, where they were exposed to the glare of the busy, festive world. This renewed encounter with the outside world incited in her feeling of inquisitiveness about her own dark past. One super one supernally fine morning, immediately after seeing her husband off to work, Oyone went out. It was already the season for women to carry parasols, so she walked along briskly in the sunlight. A few beads of sweat gathered in her forehead. Earlier, when changing into her clothes, her hand had accidentally touched the newest memorial tablet as she opened the bottom drawer of the chest. She now dwelt with each step on the unexpected sensation until at length she passed through the gates of certain I Ching divinator. Ever since childhood, Oyone had entertained the same kind of superstitions as are found in majority of otherwise enlightened citizens. At the same time, as is the general rule with such people on those occasions when she openly invoked one superstitious practice or another, it was done in playful mocking fashion. It was unprecedented then for this sort of belief to have impinged on an innermost part of her being. Seated now face to face with the divinator, it was all in seriousness that she tried to ascertain whether heaven had decreed that she was to bear a child, and if so, whether the child would survive to maturity. The divinator, who looked no different from other fortune tellers who peddled their services on the street for a coin or two, lined up his 6 blocks this way and that, shuffled his 50 long sticks, and keeping out all the while, then finally, after stroking his goatee portentously and pondering for a moment, studied Oyone's face closely and pronounced with a complete equanimity, "You cannot have any children." Oyone remained silent as she digested these words, considering them from every possible angle. Then, raising her head again, she replied with another, "Why can't I?" She had assumed that the man would deliberately again before responding, but without hesitating, he looked her straight in the eye and replied unequivocally, "You will recall that you have behaved unforgivably towards someone in the past. Your sinful behavior has become a curse that will prevent you from ever bringing a child into this world." These words were a stab to her heart. All the way home, her head drooped limply, and she had barely been able to raise it that night in front of her husband. It was this judgment rendered by the divinator that Oyone had refrained from divulging. Then, when, on this still night, with the dim glow from the lamp he had placed in the alcove about to dissolve in darkness, Sosuke first heard of this incident from Oyone's lips, he could not help but feel perturbed. Really? To concoct such a idiotic errand when your nerves were so shattered to begin with? What was the point of spending good money to hear that sort of nonsense? Did you go back again after that? Oh no, never! It's too frightening. Well, I'm glad to hear that at least. It's nothing but foolishness, Sosuke pronounced as magnanimously as he could, and went to sleep. That was the end of chapter 13. He needs therapy. Needs therapy. They both need therapy. Everyone needs therapy. Hey, you get therapy. You get therapy. You get therapy. Very sad. See now. Will chapter 4. Un momento.